This video continues with Chapter 21, I Don and #039. T want to time travel again. Marvel, the Imposter Inventor. Chapter 21, I Don and #039. T want to time travel again. Chapter 21, I don't want to time travel again. Third update, ignored the fallen phone. Luca, who had raised his head again, immediately noticed. At what was originally a normal intersection, a dump truck that had been driving in front of my car suddenly braked and stopped abruptly for some unknown reason. If Samira hadn't maintained a safe distance from the large vehicle and reacted quickly enough, just now, the front of my car could have plunged directly under the truck. Even so, Luca and his group were forced to stop their car in the middle of the road. However, just because Samira reacted quickly enough doesn't mean the other vehicles behind her reacted in the same way. Before Luca could even catch his breath, bam! There was a loud bang. As expected, the car behind crashed directly into the rear of Luca's car. The immense impact force immediately propelled the vehicle forward another section. Then came a series of bang, 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 bang sounds. It's unclear how many cars were involved in the rear-end collisions. But at this moment, the front of the vehicle Luca and his group were in was completely wedged under the large vehicle in front of them. The windshield shattered like a spider web, and the exploding airbags slammed Samira's head hard against the seat back. However, Samira couldn't care less about herself at that moment. He pulled out a sharp knife and punctured the airbag while shouting loudly at Luca, "Young master, get out of the car." Still reeling from the series of impacts, Luca, drawing on his past and present experiences with car accidents, quickly reached for his seatbelt and unbuckled it. Just boom! Another impact. This time, a car from the side lane crashed straight into Luca's car door. The impact wasn't particularly strong, but the car that crashed into it just happened to block Luca's side door. He quickly straightened his body and scanned the car in front of him. However, what he saw was that the driver of the car didn't even glance in his direction before hastily abandoning the car and driving away. Luca immediately realized that the car accident was not an accident. Sure enough, as he turned to climb to the other side to get off, he could see a huge dump truck speeding towards him from the other side of the intersection without slowing down. OS**T. There was no time to think. Even if I climbed to the other side and got out of the car, I might not be able to avoid the roaring dump truck. Looking at the shattered window of the right side door, Luca quickly regained his composure. He immediately reached for the gun holster at his waist. He immediately drew out a large, oddly shaped, dark green pistol. At the same time, he was crawling towards the car door using both his hands and feet. The blue lead strip on the pistol flashed continuously, and a series of electronic announcements sounded. Portable psychological diagnosis. System not connected, controller, startup complete, user confirmation required. Shut the hell up, activate decomposer mode. Luca roared, interrupting the tedious announcement. User confirmed, execution mode, destruction disintegration. Immediately afterwards, the dark green pistol in Luca's hand split open rapidly. As if an exposed chip, the cyan light surged continuously, transforming into rings of light that completely enveloped half of Luca's arm. A crackling sound of electricity kept ringing out. Samira, get out of the car first. Hearing Luca's roar, he also noticed the weapon in his hand that was constantly charging up. Knowing the weapon's power, she didn't hesitate at all and jumped out of the driver's seat. At that moment, Luca had already opened the car door and put one foot on the ground. The speeding dump truck was right in front of him, but Luca's eyes were filled with only a chilling coldness. Go to hell, I have no intention of time traveling again. He raised his pistol, the broadcast still ringing in his ears. Clear the target completely, be on alert. At this moment, the light cluster accumulated at the muzzle had expanded to its maximum, and the blue light band had also completely contracted, forming a chilling high-energy particle stream. Next moment, a beam of high-energy bluish-green particles shot out and instantly struck the dump truck in front of it. The cyan and white light surged continuously, transforming into a huge energy ball that crackled and popped. the terrifyingly high-temperature particles instantly cut a huge circular gash in the front of the car. As the vehicle sped forward, the cut quickly spread backward. In the blink of an eye, the high-energy particle sphere that had been hovering in front of Luca had pierced through the entire car body. The red-hot metal fragments, after being cut, broke off completely and scattered rapidly in all directions with the momentum of the dump truck. The huge dump truck was completely destroyed by this one shot. Only the circular cut corners remain, with a few remnants still intact. Rumble. Scattered fragments brushed past Luca. He could even faintly feel the heat wave generated by the hot metal flowing past his ear. The vehicles on both sides were smashed to pieces by the rapidly flying metal fragments. However, Luca, who was at the very center of the impact, was completely unharmed. All the attacks were torn apart head-on by this one shot. He stepped out of the car with one foot, letting the breeze from the heat wave caress his face. Luca paused briefly. The magnificent Dominator in his hand quickly retracted, transforming into a slightly oddly shaped dark green pistol. Even at this point, most passers-by were still confused about what had happened. But whether it was passers-by on the street or drivers who had gotten out of their cars cursing and swearing after the multi-vehicle collision, ready to find the culprit, they all stared blankly at everything Luca had caused. The entire street seemed to fall silent for a second. Until Lee, S***T. A chorus of angry curses rose and fell. Well, no one screamed. After all, the people of New York had just experienced the Chitauri invasion, and their mental resilience had been strengthened. Many people stopped and picked up their phones to record videos. As for the one who yelled "ah," that was the driver who just drove the dump truck into Luca. He's actually a sports student. Perhaps it was because they were already planning to jump off the train at the last minute, or perhaps it was just good luck. Even though the entire dump truck was torn to pieces, this guy was still alive. At this moment, only one leg had been completely disintegrated and disappeared, lying on the ground in bruises, struggling, screaming, and rolling around. Luca tucked the Dominator back into its holster at his waist, glanced at the crowd of people taking pictures, and then ignored them. Samira, who had gotten off the bus earlier, then came around from the other side. After kicking the driver, who was still screaming on the ground, unconscious, he walked over to Luca and whispered his report. The drivers of the dump truck in front and the car on the side have already fled. The driver of the car behind must have been involved in an accidental rear-end collision. Now, only this one person is left alive. Upon hearing this, Luca simply nodded slightly. After confirming that none of the vehicles behind him were at risk of smoking or exploding, he leaned against the car door and gave instructions to Samira. Contact a lawyer. We'll wait here for the police to arrive. I kind of wanted to show you this, haha, so I'm posting an extra chapter today. P.S. There should be a bonus scene at the end of this chapter. I don't know how fast the review process is. If you haven't seen it yet, please wait a little while. End of this chapter, Chapter 22, Police Community Cooperation. Chapter 22, Police Community Cooperation. After a while, a small electric scooter hurriedly drove up. The tires screeched against the ground, coming to a stop on the side of the road in a very disheveled manner. The newcomer had blonde hair, wore a suit, and carried a leather briefcase that was clearly a counterfeit. At first glance, he's just a slightly chubby young man trying to appear mature. However, after getting out of the car, the man immediately locked onto Luca and Samira, who were also standing on the side of the road being carefully avoided by passers-by, and spoke in a calm and polite tone. This must be Mr. Luca Orange, right? Hello, I am Fudge Nelson, an intern at Rand Law Firm. I'm here to temporarily assist you with this emergency. Before Luca could say anything, Samira questioned him with displeasure. Intern lawyer. It's important to understand that Orange Industries is a major client with a long-term partnership with Rand Law Firm. Even though only Luca, a 14-year-old boy, has made a request to the firm, sending only an intern lawyer seems to be a sign that Orange Industries is not taken seriously at all. Luca, on the other hand, glanced at his watch. Less than 5 minutes had passed, and the other party had arrived even faster than the New York Police Department officers. A smile immediately appeared on his face. As expected, the young man named Fudge, upon hearing Samira's question, showed no fear whatsoever, but instead calmly explained. I was only temporarily assigned here because I live nearby. Miss Simpson should already be on her way. As for my role, Mr. Orange will likely have a lot to tell me before the police arrive. I suggest we try not to waste this precious time. At this moment, Fudge, who was supposed to be the lawyer, should have been advising Luca on how to proceed with his client. But he said the opposite, making Luca look at him with newfound respect. He nodded and spoke first. Aunt Samira, could you please tell this lawyer Nelson what just happened? Upon hearing this, Samira stopped dwelling on the other party's status as an intern lawyer and stepped forward, speaking rapidly. Just now, police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks arrived one after another, and a cordon was quickly set up. A few injured people were also sent to the hospital after emergency treatment. Beside a police car at the edge of the cordon, Fudge Nelson raised his hand to interrupt the long-winded speech of the bearded police officer in front of him. Officer, this incident is clearly an assassination attempt. Under Section 20 of the New York State Criminal Code, my client, Mr. Luca Orange, was perfectly legitimate to initiate self-defense procedures when faced with a life-threatening assassination attempt. As for this electromagnetic pulse pistol, it is an experimental model registered by Orange Company, with development registration number NY 2011-1221. The process was completely legal and compliant. It has already passed non-lethal testing and certification. The bearded officer frowned as he took the screenshot from Fudge's phone, but instead of actually looking at it, he pointed to the center of the cordoned-off area. Besides a large area of ruins, there was even a bowl-shaped crater in the ground. Attorney Nelson, you call this non-lethal? That truck was completely blasted into scrap metal, and the driver who was just carried away lost a leg. This already constitutes suspected self-defense. Fudge interrupted the middle-aged police officer again. That's an assassin, not some ordinary driver. Furthermore, the truck you mentioned was speeding towards my client at 80 miles per hour, and my client's vehicle was blocked by vehicles belonging to the attacker's accomplices on all sides. According to Article 20, Paragraph 3 of the Criminal Code, this constitutes a serious violent crime, and my client has the right to unlimited self-defense. At this point, Fudge's voice suddenly rose. Officer, do you really think that in that situation, my client, a 14-year-old teenager, had any other way to escape besides taking such a huge risk and choosing to use the experimental weapon he happened to be carrying? Moreover, in a vehicle attack of that magnitude, my client was protecting not only himself, but also the other innocent civilians in that accident. The bearded police officer glanced at Luca beside him, his Adam's apple bobbing, his voice slightly hoarse. Actually, what you should be doing now is investigating who is behind this heinous attack. Instead of making things difficult for my client, a victim who has just suffered a great shock, a teenager who is only 14 years old. Seeing Fudge's imposing manner and sharp words, the bearded police officer broke out in a cold sweat and couldn't utter a single word for a moment. At this moment, another middle-aged police officer, who was clearly of a higher rank and had been inspecting the scene earlier, walked over quickly with a frown on his face. However, after seeing Luca's appearance, the newcomer was taken aback for a moment, and then nodded thoughtfully. James, there's no need to ask any further questions. Please, this gentleman. Luca Orange, Luca smiled and nodded. Please ask Mr. Luca to help you get a victim's statement from the bureau, and then send that high-powered weapon to the technical department for a briefing. You don't need to worry about anything else. But he had only just finished saying that. On the other side, a smartly dressed mature woman lifted the police cordon with one hand and entered the scene, speaking softly. Chief Stacy, I'm afraid you won't be able to get your way. This handgun involves Orange Industries' core trade secrets, and if an investigation is needed, you may require approval from the state government. Furthermore, you'll need a confidentiality review team appointed by the police, working in collaboration with Orange Industries engineers to conduct the investigation. Ms. Simpson, Fudge gave a slight bow to the newcomer. Gerald Simpson, a senior partner at the law firm of DeLan, is Fudge's direct superior. Ms. Simpson first nodded and smiled at Luca before turning her attention back to Chief Stacy. The middle-aged director, George Stacy, rubbed his temples with a great headache. The young, chubby guy was already troublesome enough, and now a well-known New York lawyer has joined the fray. These lawyers are all incredibly difficult to deal with. This is why he previously delegated communication between his subordinates and the victim's lawyers. However, he had no intention of making things difficult for Luca. Now that the opposing lawyer had offered a way out, he took the opportunity to shrug helplessly and said, "We need to take statements, right? That way we can find out who's behind this attack more quickly." Upon hearing this, Ms. Simpson turned to look at Luca again and added, "Mr. Luca, remember, the necessity of self-defense does not depend on the power of the weapon, but on the timeliness of the violence. Today you not only protected yourself, but also saved the jobs of all the employees of Orange Industries. Therefore, whether or not to cooperate with the police investigation is entirely up to you." Upon hearing this, Chief George's temple throbbed with a vein. Fortunately, this time Luca did not refuse, but instead gave him a kind smile. "We would be delighted to cooperate with the police." End of this chapter. Chapter 23, Lawyer Police. Chapter 23, Lawyer Police. Outside the New York 1st Precinct. Looking at Ms. Simpson and Fudge in front of him, Luca politely shook hands with each of them to express his gratitude. This time, thanks to Ms. Simpson, she truly lived up to the reputation of the great lawyer my mother always praised. She really opened my eyes. "Mr. Orange, you flatter me. It is my honor to serve you." Having already heard far too many praises and thanks, Ms. Simpson simply nodded reservedly, her professional smile unwavering, and continued speaking. "I have heard about your father's passing. I'm sorry I couldn't attend the funeral. Ms. Gina and I are friends. If you have any legal needs in the future, you can contact me anytime." Well, how should I put it? Ms. Simpson's words were indeed sincere. The main issue is that while Luca's inheritance situation isn't inherently complicated or controversial due to the existence of a clear will, the sheer size of the Orange family's assets means that legal fees related to inheritance are substantial. Even for a large law firm like Rand & Co., it's still a significant case. Moreover, simple cases mean easy work. At times like these, Ms. Simpson certainly wouldn't mind doing Luca a favor to secure the business. Knowing perfectly well what the other person was thinking, Luca didn't immediately say anything, but simply smiled and offered polite compliments. "Then I thank you very much, Ms. Simpson. With your help, I think I can approach legal matters with more peace of mind from now on." After speaking, Luca turned to look at Fudge, who had been silently following behind Ms. Simpson ever since she appeared, trying to keep his presence to himself and become invisible. By this time, Luca had already remembered the other party's identity. Fudge Nelson is Matt Murdock's childhood friend, fellow lawyer, and partner in the TV series Daredevil. He is also an outstanding lawyer with exceptional abilities, combining flexibility with a strong sense of justice. However, because the other person's appearance was quite different from that in the show, Luca did not recognize him immediately. It wasn't until George Stacy, the famous Spider-Woman Gwen Stacy's father, appeared that Luca's thoughts started to wander, and he remembered that the other person was also a character in the story. Yes, Chief George is also a supporting character in the story, and he's much more famous than Fudge. All I can say is that today was truly a coincidence. Mr. Fudge is currently just an intern at Rand Law Firm, right? Would you be interested in becoming my private lawyer later? Upon hearing this, the other three people present were all slightly taken aback, wondering why Luca would suddenly have such an idea. Ms. Simpson was the first to react, and then she laughed and joked. "My boss is still right here. Mr. Luca, are you trying to poach someone right in front of me?" Luca nodded slightly, showing no embarrassment on his face, and continued speaking, taking advantage of his youth. "I just think highly of Mr. Fudge's future potential. If possible, I don't think Ms. Simpson would be reluctant to part with an intern lawyer, would she? In large law firms like Rand Corporation, there is a significant difference between trainee lawyers and assistant lawyers. Although they are all low-level employees at law firms, the intern lawyers are mostly law students from top universities who have not yet graduated, so their relationship with the law firm is not very close. If an intern lawyer has the opportunity to become a wealthy person's private lawyer, it is definitely much better than struggling in a law firm after graduation. Moreover, private lawyers can be affiliated with law firms, which won't cause any gaps in the cooperation between Orange Industries and Rand Law Firm. However, when Fudge heard a 14-year-old boy, much younger than himself, praise him and say he was optimistic about his future potential, he couldn't help but slightly lose his composure. Thank you for your high regard, Mr. Orange, but I am still in the learning and improvement stage, so I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. Upon hearing this, Luca simply nodded slightly and did not say anything further. This left even Fudge completely baffled. In fact, Luca chose to take the initiative to invite the other party, not only because of the goodwill he felt towards the other party's identity as a character in the story, but also because he had some understanding of the other party's abilities and personality. At least in terms of character, Fudge, this heroic partner, is completely trustworthy. However, having a strong sense of justice also means that such a person cannot tolerate any wrongdoing. Luca knew perfectly well that, given his personality, now that he had come to this free society and had a good start, he would definitely enjoy the conveniences brought by capital in the future. It's unlikely that he'd become a heartless capitalist, or at least a genuinely good person overflowing with a sense of justice. Therefore, he did not feel too much regret about being rejected by such righteous people. After watching the two leave, Luca pondered silently as he looked at Fudge's retreating figure. Right now, Fudge is just a graduating intern lawyer, so Attorney Ma probably hasn't officially debuted as Daredevil yet. I wonder how many of those other street heroes are still dormant, or do they even exist in this parallel universe? If given the chance, Luca would really like to try recruiting a few street heroes who aren't so strong in their sense of justice to work for him. Unlike those Avengers heroes, whose backgrounds are all incredibly profound. At least in Luca's memory, people like the Punisher, Frank Castle, and Jessica Jones were not only quite capable, but they weren't entirely pure righteous people who couldn't tolerate any wrongdoing before they became street heroes. Recruiting such well-known characters from the original work is far more cost-effective than hiring ordinary people, both in terms of ability and trustworthiness. It seems we'll need to send someone to investigate the current situation of these guys from my memory. Just as Luca was thinking this, George Stacy strode out of the police station. Seeing that Luca and the other person were still there, he breathed a sigh of relief, straightened his collar, and walked over. "Mr. Orange, here is the attachment to your police report." As she spoke, George Stacy handed a document to Luca. Samira stepped forward and took the documents from Luca. Luca, meanwhile, looked at Director George with utter bewilderment. It would be perfectly fine to mail this to him later, and even if it were to be given to him personally, it shouldn't be the director who should rush out to deliver it. "Is there anything else Chief George wanted to see me about?" George Stacy stared intently at Luca's face before speaking again. "Can we talk just the two of us?" End of this chapter. Chapter 24, Give Me 10 Vibrators. Chapter 24, Give Me 10 Vibrators. Third update. Could it be that Chief George is also interested in the weapons developed by Orange Industries? Seeing George Stacy's hesitant expression, Luca casually asked as he walked toward the corner of the building. There was a reason he asked that. As mentioned before, recently, due to the large number of Chitauri weapons left in Manhattan after the Battle of New York, the situation has become more complicated. This has led to several recent violent crimes in New York City involving the use of alien weapons. The harm caused by these incidents is clearly incomparable to that of the petty crimes committed previously. Previously, I used the Dominator to blow up a large truck with one shot. Although the so-called company prototype that was actually registered was just a failed high-energy ion gun that had once served as a core component of the Dominator. However, to those who don't understand, this portable, high-powered weapon clearly has a very promising future. However, George Stacy shook her head awkwardly. Well, no, that's not it. Although I am very optimistic about your company's products, the procurement of equipment is not something I can decide on my own. Although George Stacy, as the New York City Police Commissioner, certainly wielded considerable power. However, the issue of such weapons orders not only requires review by various departments within the New York Police Department, such as finance, auditing, and logistics, but also ultimately needs to be approved by the New York City Mayor's office. Not to mention the cumbersome procedures involved in bidding, tendering, and government funding. At most, his position as bureau chief only granted him a limited amount of advisory authority. However, Chief George didn't keep everyone in suspense, explaining only the equipment issue before continuing. Our investigation revealed that the truck driver you injured had a high level of alcohol in his system, indicating that he had been drinking continuously while driving. What, does Chief George think this incident was an accident? Luca asked with a hint of amusement. No, in fact, the investigation results showed that the other party had a large amount of alcohol in his stomach and intestines, and it hadn't even been fully absorbed. Therefore, we suspect that the driver was just trying to cover up his crime by drinking. My current assessment is that this incident was most likely a premeditated malicious attack. Samira, standing to the side, rolled her eyes. Why did they need to repeat such an obvious thing to them? Chief George ignored Samira's gaze and kept staring at Luca, talking incessantly. As for what you said about the possibility that the mastermind behind the attack might be related to your uncle, Mr. Dragon Orange, it cannot be confirmed at the moment. However, our police will do our best to find the real culprit and bring him to justice. Therefore, we hope that Mr. Orange will cooperate more with our police work in the future. Upon hearing this, Luca raised an eyebrow and then handed over his business card. In fact, Luca had already taken down Samira's phone number at the police station, and now handing over his business card was a way of expressing his approval of George Stacy. Then I thank Chief George in advance for getting justice for me. Upon seeing the business card handed to her, George Stacy hesitated for a moment before accepting it and then taking her leave. As Luca watched him return to the police station, he had a feeling that the man's hasty departure to find him meant more than just telling him this much. In fact, the reason why Luca chose to call the police and cooperate with their work, and even directly revealed information about his Uncle Dragon, was precisely because he wanted to use police intervention to uncover the person behind Dragon. Yes, although he hadn't figured out the attacker's identity yet, he had already blamed it on his uncle. Otherwise, Luca didn't believe it was such a coincidence that the other party had just provoked him, and then he was involved in a car accident. What if the final outcome wasn't an attack caused by Dragon? So even if he's killing two birds with one stone, it's only the New York Police Department's energy that's being wasted, and he himself doesn't lose anything. After watching George Stacy leave, the company had already sent another new car to wait outside the police station. After getting into the car, Luca leaned back wearily against the seat. After a whole day of funerals and car accidents, he was completely exhausted. In fact, Luca has been spending almost all his time at the hospital taking care of his mother, Gina, these past few days. In addition, he also has to manage his father's funeral. So many other things have been temporarily postponed. Now that this whole mess has happened, he has a feeling that his life in the future might not be very peaceful. By the way, Aunt Samira, have the things I ordered arrived yet? Young master, everything was prepared yesterday, but because we are going to hold Mister's funeral today, I had all the things temporarily piled up in the living room. Luca nodded upon hearing this, but then he looked at the brand new prosthetic limb that Tony Stark had given him. Or rather, the pale blue panel floating on this prosthetic limb. Yes, those core components only pop up the crafting panel when you actually interact with them, so they don't affect Luca in any way. However, since this mechanical prosthesis is directly pressed onto one's own arm, It is always in contact with the body. Luca didn't know how to cancel the panel, and the bright light blue panel kept swaying back and forth with his arm. Although it has no collision volume, its semi-transparent state does not obstruct the view. But in his own eyes, the white glowing arm and the glaringly dark blue panel always gave Luca an urge to reach out and tap a couple of times to do something. We have to synthesize this thing as soon as possible. What's with this eerie, ghostly glow? With this in mind, Luca spoke again, referring to the required synthetic consumables on the panel. Aunt Samira, I need to trouble you again to contact the company's logistics department and send 5 more different models of grappling hook guns and 5 smaller hydraulic transmission rods under 50 centimeters. At this point, Luca paused slightly. He wondered in his head what kind of thing could be considered a miniature therapeutic device, according to the synthesis panel's criteria. Okay, also order 1 low-frequency therapy device, 1 microwave therapy device for the shoulders and neck, 1 laser and 1 infrared light therapy device, and 1 magnetic therapy bracelet. All of them should be the smallest models available on the market. The specific efficacy, strength, and brand are not important. Although Samira was somewhat puzzled by what Luca said, she still meticulously recorded all of his requirements. She knew that since her husband's death, young Master Luca had been working hard to research and tinker with these strange things. They also collected a lot of various materials and equipment. Moreover, it wasn't entirely ineffective. At least the magical pistol that the young master called Dominator was something he had secretly crafted without his knowledge. Samira didn't understand scientific research, but she was well aware of the amazing power of the weapon during the test. In Samira's mind, young Master Luca is now a super scientific genius who can rival her late husband. So even when Luca made some strange material requests, she never hesitated to prepare them. After all, the world of geniuses is always harder to understand. Just when Samira thought that the young master's request was over, Luca glanced at the last item on the panel, synthesis consumables, and spoke again in a calm tone. Also, give me 10 more vibrators of different models and sizes. I'll post 3 more chapters today. Actually, it's not good to update too much during the new book period. I mainly want to ask everyone for more reading, monthly votes, and comments. These metrics, especially daily reading, are very important for the book's performance during its initial release period. I felt bad asking for help without any real assistance, so I posted an extra chapter. Thank you all in advance. End of this chapter, Chapter 25, New Props. Chapter 25, New Props. Samira, who was taking notes with her head down, had just put down her pen when she suddenly jerked her head up again. His mouth gaped open, his pupils contracted, and he stared in disbelief at the nonchalant Luca. It's not just her. Even the company employees who came along with the new car and temporarily acted as drivers couldn't help, but subconsciously want to turn around and take a look at their company's future heir. However, perhaps it was because they couldn't bear to lose this well-paid job. The driver eventually managed to straighten his head through sheer willpower. Then, while concentrating on driving, he listened carefully and occasionally glanced at Luca in the rearview mirror. Young master, isn't this inappropriate? You're still so young, that kind of thing. Hearing Aunt Samira's hesitant, trembling voice, Luca forced a smile and continued in a calm tone. Aunt Samira, what are you thinking? I just need these things for my next invention. You can just prepare them for me. But young master's company doesn't have any similar products, Samira stammered. And it didn't say that it would be taken from the company. Like those medical instruments, it can be purchased from outside. Okay. Hearing that Luca seemed quite determined, Samira finally gritted her teeth and wrote down the words vibrator on the paper. However, this time she doesn't plan to arrange for anyone else to handle the order. She wants to purchase everything herself. She was, after all, a middle-aged woman. Although she had never been married, she was quite adept at buying these things and showed absolutely no shyness. The reason they were so nervous just now was simply because the elders were worried that Luca would grow up to be a bad person. Now that I've calmed down, I haven't dwelled on this matter much. After stealing a glance at Luca, I noticed that the boy's gaze had become vacant again, and I wondered what he was thinking. Samira could only sigh silently. I don't know if little Luca is thinking about a new invention, or if he misses his parents. Either way is fine. At least it's good to have something to keep me busy. After carefully putting away the papers she had written down, Samira turned around and began to ponder. The question is whether to fire this temporary driver from the company or try to transfer him to a factory far away from the New York headquarters. Luca, on the other hand, breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Samira was no longer paying attention to him, and at the same time sighed in his heart. It's true, it's good to be rich. If there's no company or funds, and he has to prepare and gather these things on his own, not to mention the cost of frequent trial and error, even if he can just happen to buy the qualified items needed for synthetic consumables every time, it will definitely take a lot of effort. However, it seems we'll still need to find an extra full-time assistant to handle these trivial matters. Samira is, after all, a warrior. It's really too much to ask of her to be a housekeeper and secretary. However, this brings us back to the issue of control over the company and its funds. Either cure Gina, or we deal with the company. We need to find a breakthrough as soon as possible. An hour and a half later, inside a seaside villa in Greenwich, Connecticut, it was nearing evening. Looking at the messy items piled up in the villa's living room, Luca rubbed his head in exasperation. Aunt Samira, why don't you go and inform them about recalling that combat team and procuring materials? These two things are quite important. As for this place, I'll handle it myself. After seeing Samira off, Luca simply plopped down in the middle of the living room. This villa is currently one of the Orange family's properties in Connecticut. Although it's not in New York City, it's actually not far from Lower Manhattan, just over an hour's drive away. The family of 3 would occasionally come over for a short stay on weekends to escape the hustle and bustle of Manhattan and relax. However, the apartment on the Upper East Side is currently severely damaged. In addition, Manhattan is currently in complete chaos, with martial law in place everywhere. So Luca temporarily moved here, turning his vacation into a permanent residence. Well, he said he'd be staying here permanently, but these past few days, Luca has spent most of his time at the hospital. As for the huge mess in the living room right now, some of the supplies were purchased and collected by Luca's subordinates, while others were simply delivered directly from the company. The selection is incredibly diverse, including daily necessities, toys, models, weapon samples, and all sorts of other items. The main issue is that Luca is still somewhat unclear about how to trigger the core components of his cheat system, or what exactly constitutes a core component. All he knew was that indirect images, such as photos and videos, could not allow him to see the faint light emanating from the core components. Helpless, he could only have someone buy some random, miscellaneous items and send them over, waiting for him to personally inspect them one by one. However, it seems that this approach is not very efficient at present. Luca had scanned the area and hadn't seen anything that emitted that unique white light that belonged to the core components. It seems we can't do it this way anymore. It's too inefficient and troublesome to deal with. However, when I met those Avengers before, almost everyone had a core component. At least starting with the characters in the story is a viable approach. Then, Luca thought of the strength-enhancing shoes he was wearing. The core components of these shoes were just ordinary items found in a regular shoe store, with no particularly impressive origins. Perhaps going shopping more often and selecting items in bulk from malls is a good approach. While pondering these things, Luca did not choose to immediately open and inspect the unopened packages one by one. Instead, he went straight to the 2 boxes placed in the corner of the living room. One of them was larger and had the Orange Industries logo printed on it. Clearly, it was an accessory or prop that Luca had commissioned the company to send over. As for the other, smaller box, it looks just like an ordinary red medical kit, with a white background and red cross printed on it. However, in Luca's eyes, the box emitted a unique, shimmering white light. Yes, the reason Luca, who had been staying at the hospital for so many days, chose to go home today was not only because he wanted to try to find any new crafting items among the miscellaneous items he had collected. The more important reason is that Luca has indeed encountered another new core component these days. End of this chapter, Chapter 26 Big White, Testing the Cheat Code. Chapter 26 Big White, Testing the Cheat Code. He stepped forward and pressed the red medical kit. A light blue panel popped up instantly. Big White Big Hero 6 World 1/5 Manufacturer. Masashi Hamada Core Component. Red Medical. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. 1 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chai. Description: inflatable medical robot. This high-tech medical robot can be stored in a medical kit anytime, anywhere. It contains tens of thousands of medical knowledge entries and possesses strong AI learning capabilities. In addition to its health monitoring and emergency treatment capabilities, it also boasts advantages such as being lightweight, sturdy, and capable of high-powered operation. It is a highly qualified professional-grade medical companion. Friendly reminder. Of course, if your mechanical engineering skills are decent, it might be much more than just a medical robot ~s. The new core component that Luca found this time can be synthesized into Baymax from Big Hero 6. Unfortunately, this Baymax isn't the combat-type Baymax that the protagonist, Hiro Hamada, modified and upgraded. Instead, it's the initial version created by his brother, Tadashi Hamada, a medical-type Baymax. As for saying it was a core component that was found, that makes sense too. Luca had considered it while he was taking care of her at the hospital. Perhaps he could use his special ability to synthesize some kind of high-tech healing item to cure his mother, Gina. If you want a high-tech treatment device, then the core components that form its foundation are more likely to be found in a hospital. However, Luca originally targeted the hospital's existing equipment, or various bottles and jars of medicine. Unexpectedly, by a twist of fate, it was this ordinary discarded first aid kit that successfully triggered the cheat code. That's good too. The technology in Big Hero 6 seems to be far more advanced than in the real world of 2012. Perhaps the tens of thousands of medical knowledge records in Baymax actually contain a way to cure Gina. Even if that doesn't work, having multiple combat units that are easy to modify is still a good option. That's right, although the friendly reminder on the panel seems to be criticizing Luca's poor research capabilities. However, in reality, it's not possible to upgrade Baymax into a low-end version of the Mark armor like Hiro Hamada, the protagonist of the Big Hero 6 movie. However, simply adding some armor and inputting some combat information is still something Luca can easily handle. Thanks to the guidance he received from his father during his lifetime, as well as his participation in numerous robot competitions and his hands-on creation of weapons and machinery, he was not a complete novice with no foundation whatsoever. Perhaps in the Marvel universe, he can't be compared to those freakish geniuses who handcraft armor and invent cutting-edge technology in their teens. But in the ordinary world, he would certainly be considered a genius teenager. Luca, who inherited everything from the original owner, is now considered an entry-level electromechanical engineer. Luca pulled his hand away from the medical kit, and without looking for a utility knife, simply used his key to open the large box that had been sent by the company. There were quite a few materials he needed scattered inside. Moreover, considering the uncertainty of the demand for gold finger synthesis consumables, these materials are also prepared in many different models. After drawing a circle on the ground with chalk, the red medical kit was solemnly placed in the center of the circle. Next, Luca did not take out the custom-made carbon fiber mechanical skeleton and the inflatable doll that imitated Luca's hand-drawn Baymax from the package. Instead, he pulled out a robot skeleton that was only about the size of a palm, and an ordinary Greninja inflatable toy that was not much bigger than the skeleton and looked very cheap. This palm-sized robot skeleton was even made by Luca based on the most rudimentary robot toy he made as a child, according to the original owner's memories. He then used his home 3D printer to replace the materials with carbon fiber and print it out. The reason Luca created these two completely unrelated things was to test the limits of his cheat ability. With a mix of anticipation and trepidation, Luca first placed the robot skeleton, which might struggle to even take 2 steps, into a separate large circle in the center of the circular array. The next moment, the originally ordinary and simple mechanical skeleton also lit up with white light, and slowly connected with the white light on the red medical box. It actually works. Even Luca himself was somewhat incredulous at the sight. It's worth noting that, regardless of the complexity of the original Baymax's mechanical skeleton structure, its height was at least similar to that of an average person. But now, this tiny, crude skeleton of mine can actually be used as material. So it's true that as long as the size isn't mentioned and the name matches, anything, regardless of size, can pass the test. What about the quantity of materials? What about the law of conservation of mass? As soon as he finished speaking, Luca slapped himself across the face. How stupid of me to talk to a cheat code about the law of conservation of mass. Isn't the more outrageous the better? Well, getting slapped in the face does hurt quite a bit, so in the end he just touched it lightly, just to make a gesture, without even a sound. Our gaze returned to the circular magic circle. After confirming that the mechanical skeleton had passed the test, Luca placed the Greninja inflatable doll next to him into another circle within the magic circle. However, this time, the Greninja doll did not light up white like the previous mechanical skeleton. What's going on? Are you looking down on Greninja? It's clearly a humanoid Pokémon with arms and legs. Some of the more skeptical Luca took out the Greninja frog and placed a similarly sized Ultraman doll into the magic circle. Now the inflatable doll was finally lit up, and the white light was restored. What kind of bizarre judgment is this? Never mind, it's good that it's lit up. Although there are still many unclear aspects in the exploration of cheat codes, at least there has been some progress. Luca didn't dwell on it any longer. After simply recording this information, he placed all the other customized materials into the magic circle one by one. The device contained only a smart chip that recorded the contents of a medical textbook, ordinary medical spray in an aluminum can, semi-finished lithium batteries produced in a laboratory, a rudimentary scanner with ridiculously low precision, and a mini projector with appallingly low resolution. This time, there were no further unexpected events, and all items were successfully identified through the magic circle. The enormous circular magic circle was completely filled with white light. Luca clapped his hands against the edge of the magic circle, silently chanting, "Synthesize." The white light surged and then contracted dramatically. Finally, only a completely transformed red box remained in the center of the magic circle. End of this chapter. Chapter 27, Extra Program Laws. Chapter 27, Extra Program Laws. With his gaze fixed on the futuristic red box that was neatly placed on the ground, Luca stepped forward expectantly and gently tapped the outer shell of the box. Dong 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 tilde. No response. However, it seems that the casing is also made of carbon fiber. After fiddling with it for a while, even the motherboard chip of Big White was popped out by Luca pressing the very conspicuous round chip compartment, but the robot as a whole still did not seem to be starting up. After reinstalling the chip, Luca briefly recalled the plot of the original Big Hero 6 story before tentatively speaking with some hesitation. It hurts tilde. It was just a feigned scream. The red box, which had been completely silent before, suddenly lit up with a circular light strip around the chip compartment, followed by a faint beeping alarm. Immediately afterwards, the red storage box unfolded quickly. The white filler inside inflates rapidly like a balloon. In a short while, an inflatable robot, somewhat resembling a Michelin Man, stood on the open storage box. The chubby robot first looked down at its surroundings, then blinked in confusion before taking small steps out of the storage box and heading towards Luca. However, the living room of the villa where Luca was located was already cluttered with a large pile of packages, and there were also many obstacles blocking its way. The chubby, white, inflatable robot wasn't in a hurry. It slowly began to repeat the process. Bow down. Bend over. Move. Take small, quick steps forward. This guy was actually planning to move all the obstructing debris to both sides, one by one. This scene completely broke Luca's guard, who had been full of anticipation. He rushed over and haphazardly shoved all those things to the sides before the inflatable robot finally stood still and looked at him again. The inflatable robot raised its right hand, which had only 4 fingers, and a very gentle but slightly dull electronic voice sounded from inside its body. I am Big White, your personal healthcare partner. Luca breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Big White had finally started working normally. However, Debai's next words left him stunned. Hello, Luca. You know my name. At this moment, Luca was truly filled with questions. Although it was mentioned in the previous synthesis panel that Baymax has tens of thousands of medical knowledge reserves inside. This indicates that the robot he synthesized should possess all the information loaded by the original Hamada Masashi, and may even include some original recordings in addition to this information and the artificial intelligence program. However, no matter what, Debai's name shouldn't be in the database. Even with the previous Dominator pistol, it was only after I synthesized the item that I was granted usage rights through a basic response procedure, and the recording of information such as voice print and fingerprint. However, when Luca asked the question, the big white thing in front of him tilted its head and looked at him with a slightly puzzled expression. Black circle, yes, I know your name, Luca von Orange. I noticed you needed medical help because you cried out pain, etc., etc. Luca interrupted Big White's somewhat monotonous monologue by speaking directly, and continued with his previous question. How do you know my name? Black circle, black circle. According to the zeroth law, Luca von Orange is designated as the highest authority and must completely obey all orders of the highest authority. The large, black eye-like camera blinked twice before quickly replying. The zeroth law, does that mean there are other first and second laws? Luca asked immediately afterward. The only out-of-program law is the zeroth law, which takes precedence over everything else. The first law within the programmed code is, a robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to die. Big White's voice continued to broadcast, but Luca had already fallen into deep thought. Extra procedural law, and it even specifies that I have the highest authority. Even a fool could tell that this was definitely due to the amazing power of the cheat system. In fact, Luca had similar concerns when he obtained the core components of Big White. The items I synthesized before, even the Dominator pistol with its smart chip, were at best limited to basic functions like scanning, responding, and confirming identity. Only Big White, which I synthesized this time, truly possesses advanced artificial intelligence with autonomous evolution and an emotional module. If technological creations with advanced artificial intelligence, such as the Red Queen from Resident Evil or the T-800 from the Terminator series, couldn't guarantee loyalty and ended up killing themselves after being synthesized, it would be a huge joke. The reason Luca dared to synthesize Baymax so confidently this time was because his version of Baymax was just a medical robot with medical functions, so he didn't have to worry about betrayal or anything like that. However, it seems that his cheat system has already thoughtfully taken care of this problem for him. However, Luca sees this extra program law that Debai speaks of as having both advantages and disadvantages. The benefits are self-evident. This kind of superhuman power means that even if someone tampers with your AI program, you can regain control with just a word, and no one can take it away. As for the downsides, the extra program law means that even Luca himself cannot replicate this program. If it's not a system creation, but a replica he makes using technical means, he probably won't be able to enjoy this benefit of absolute loyalty. That was still a bit too greedy. The current situation couldn't be better. We can be more confident and bolder when synthesizing these intelligent entities in the future. Luca, having received some truly good news, snapped out of his daze, while Big White finished reciting all those fragmented laws and resumed his previous work. Scan complete. No external injury that could cause pain was detected. We detected fluctuations in your neurotransmitters and hormones, which indicates tension and mild anxiety. There are no treatment options for similar cases in our database, so we need to expand our database. We detected a partial amputation of your right forearm below the elbow. It has been effectively treated, and you are now wearing a prosthetic arm. We recommend that you perform resistance training and muscle contraction exercises regularly to ensure the health of your limb. As he spoke, Big White's chest lit up and began projecting rehabilitation exercises through its internal system. Stop, stop, stop. I'll do this when I have time later. Completely oblivious to what Big White had said before, Luca waved his hands repeatedly until he saw Big White stop playing the projection. Only then did he resume asking questions, his expression becoming more serious. I'd like to know if your database contains any treatments for synaptic cocooning syndrome. End of this chapter. Chapter 28, Hope for a Cure. Chapter 28, Hope for a Cure. The neural synaptic cocooning syndrome that Luca mentioned in his question is the same illness that his mother Gina is currently suffering from. Now that he had acquired Baymax, a robot with more advanced medical data, he naturally wanted to find a way to cure it. This is not only to save the company, but also for their own future development and other interests. It was also for the sake of the mother who had loved, cared for, and looked after the original owner since childhood. Even in the face of crisis, just before she fell into a coma, Gina was still thinking about and protecting this stranger. Luca looked at the giant white figure in front of him with a complicated expression. Fortunately, after quickly searching the database in the chip, Dabai immediately provided an answer. Neural synapse simplification syndrome is caused by see Chapter 14. Patients experiencing nerves being encased in cocoon-like mutant proteins, depending on the intensity of the energy pulses they receive. We recommend using magnetically driven nanorobots for targeted removal surgery, which can quickly remove the damaged cocoon protein layer and restore the patient's nerve signals. Luca, who had only listened to the first half of the speech and whose brows had just relaxed, immediately frowned again after Dabai stopped speaking. Magnetic-driven nanorobots. Baymax, do you possess this kind of treatment? Black circle, black circle. With the availability of a nanotherapy chamber, or nanorobot drugs combined with a targeted magnetic navigation device, I possess the corresponding operational skills. Upon hearing this, Luca's face immediately darkened. Without a doubt, this thing is a medical device that only exists in the world that Baymax lives in. The world he's in now is probably only remotely related to the cradle of regeneration that will create vision in the future. However, that thing also seems to prefer repairing external injuries using nanotechnology, and whether it can achieve the effect that Dabai mentioned is still unknown. Still somewhat unwilling to give up, Luca continued to ask, do you have the manufacturing data for these two instruments in your database? Aside from the manufacturing process of Big White itself, no information related to the manufacture of medical instruments was found in the database. Luca shook his head helplessly upon hearing this. However, the fact that Big White has its own production process within its database is good news. At least Luca might actually be able to replicate a similar product using this information. However, the current basic version of Baymax is actually quite inferior in terms of technical capabilities compared to the upgraded combat version of Baymax developed by Hiroshi Hamada. The combat version of the Great White's unscientific flight control system, jet propulsion device, scanning enhancement device, and other equipment can be described as cutting-edge technology. The standard version of Baymax features a high-energy storage lithium battery, a powerful and flexible mechanical exoskeleton, a wide-range precision scanner, an evolving AI with an emotional module, and over 10,000 advanced medical records. Even the regular Baymax seems ridiculous enough. While Luca's thoughts were wandering, perhaps sensing his disappointment, Dubai tilted its head and spoke again. In the absence of treatment equipment, targeted protein phagocytosis drugs can be used as an adjunct therapy. Continuous use can slowly clear cocooned proteins, and the recovery time depends on the patient's condition. Upon hearing this, Luca was initially delighted, but after considering Dubai's previous answer, his expression immediately changed, and he asked again with some uncertainty. Can you make this kind of targeted drug? Black circle, black circle. Relevant targeted drugs can be purchased at designated pharmacies. As he spoke, the projection screen on Big White's chest lit up again, quickly listing a long list of names and addresses of major pharmacies. However, when Luca saw that the top few pharmacies all started with Jiujinction, his initial excitement immediately vanished. Can you say something useful? To everyone's surprise, the screen changed again as soon as he said that. The product displayed prominently featured the name, targeted drug for neurosynaptic cocooning syndrome, followed by a long list of chemical bonds and the proportions of several other chemical components. That works too. Is there a preparation process for this drug? Luca asked. No preparation process was found in the database. Hearing this answer, Luca was somewhat disappointed, but he was not discouraged. With the chemical structure and formulation of the drug known, at least we can see a glimmer of hope. With the cooperation of laboratories in the relevant field, there is still a high probability that this drug can be produced. In fact, with current technology, it is not impossible to make similar drugs. However, firstly, this disease was already very rare before, and without sufficient demand, established large laboratories would not have taken the initiative to research this specific drug. Now that we have a clear direction, both the difficulty and the production process will be greatly simplified. As long as we invest enough funds, it is not too complicated to successfully produce it. After all, what Luca wanted was not to mass-produce this drug industrially and make a profit from its sale. If it's just about laboratory preparation, it's simply a matter of cost. Thanks, Big White. Luca, whose emotions had been repeatedly stirred up by this chubby white creature, relaxed and went forward to hug its soft body without any hesitation. It really does look like a marshmallow. Seeing himself being embraced, Big White instinctively wrapped his arms around Luca, completely enveloping him in his supple body. We detected that your neurotransmitter levels are steadily rising and hormone secretion is stabilizing. This indicates that your anxiety symptoms are being relieved. Luca was slightly taken aback when he heard the voice announcement from Big White. Then I remembered that Big White had indeed diagnosed me with mild anxiety symptoms. However, Luca simply smiled nonchalantly. Even though he himself believed that his mindset and resilience were slightly better than the average person. But with time travel, battles, the Orange Company, and his own personal crisis, all sorts of troubles piled up, resulting in only mild anxiety. After giving Big White another tight hug, Luca gently pulled away and gave Big White a smile. At times like this, let's not talk about such discouraging things as the diagnosis results. This has been recorded in the care matrix, confirming the completion of treatment. To allow me to enter dormant mode, you need to say, "I am satisfied with your service." Looking at the big guy's serious and methodical appearance, Luca smiled helplessly and shook his head. It seems I need to practice more on the dialogue and emotion modules. With these thoughts in mind, Luca decided not to utter the dormant word, and instead let Big White remain powered on and stay with him. I will always be by your side. The big white dog, following the command, stood motionless in place, seemingly believing that this was enough to keep the other company. Sure enough, their behavior pattern is still a bit rigid. The start and stop commands also need a slight adjustment. However, we still need to see just how complex Bai's core program really is. If it's too difficult, it won't be easy to modify. Here's a question. If Baymax killed someone, would everyone feel bad about it? End of this chapter. Chapter 29, Opening the Blind Box. Chapter 29, opening the blind box, Luca's proposed program modifications were certainly not as simple as just changing voice commands. As mentioned before, Baymax is not just a simple medical robot. With just a few adjustments, it can also be quite adept at combat. Considering that inputting combat information, modifying some commands, and creating external armor for Big White would all take a lot of time, Luca thought for a moment and decided to wait and do it later. What he wants to do right now is naturally, "Big White, come help me open this package." Looking at the densely packed pile of odds and ends in the living room, Luca himself felt a bit of a headache. This mess of stuff looks like opening a blind box. Big White, who had been given the order by Luca, tilted his head in confusion and looked at Luca with bewilderment. "There is no open package command in my database." It's okay. Watch my next move, learn it first, and then I'll help you." Upon hearing this, Bai immediately stood up straight, his big eyes fixed on Luca's every move. Black circle, black circle. In fact, most of the items in the living room at this time were everyday necessities that Luca casually mentioned, and then had his subordinates go out to place orders for. From firearms and ammunition to infant toys and various electronic products. In short, Luca would just browse online for a bit, and whatever he saw, he would simply have someone place an order or buy it from a physical store. As for the small portion, it was based on Luca's own recollection of the technological gadgets he had seen in movies and anime from his previous life, which he speculated might be core components. Things like piquet ball toys, props and accessories for certain cosplay outfits, or glasses and watches are often given a high-tech attribute in movies and TV shows. However, Luca himself didn't really have high hopes that even one of these things could trigger the cheat code. Let's take shoes as an example again. If Luca hadn't yet synthesized the strength-enhancing shoes, the chances of triggering his cheat ability with just 1 or 2 pairs of shoes bought by his subordinates were far too slim. Fortunately, money is a minor issue. All Luca had to do was open the package and see if there was anything glowing inside. Moreover, most of these items in the living room are either unpackaged or already in transparent packaging. A quick glance is enough to tell that they are not core components. This also greatly reduced his actual workload. However, if there is a next time, I'll just have them unpack the entire package and deliver it to me. Do you need me to contact someone else to help you solve this problem? Black circle, black circle. It's nothing. I was just talking to myself. After all, this was the first time he had done something like this, and Luca himself hadn't quite gotten used to the mindset of a wealthy capitalist yet. He had only been thinking about personally confirming this point. Never mind, let's get these things sorted out first. As he spoke, Luca walked first to the largest package in the living room. The rectangular hardboard packaging, which is a little over 2 meters long, looks like a flat door panel at first glance. Well, actually, it's just a door panel. This is what Luca saw online. A pure wood framed pink wooden door, which, according to the seller, could be used as a bedroom door for a young girl. When I first said I wanted to buy this door, Samira stared at me with a strange look for a long time. However, the reason Luca wanted to buy it and try it out was naturally, because its design was too similar to Doraemon's Anywhere door. Even though this product is so convenient and easy to use, Luca doubted that he could gather the necessary materials for its synthesis. But one must always have dreams, right? It really doesn't work. Without even opening it completely, just by tearing open a corner of the packaging, Luca was already able to confirm that there was no white light at all. Why do I feel a little unwilling? Perhaps I should go back to the manufacturer's warehouse to take another look. Thinking about it, if it were Tony Stark, he would probably just buy the manufacturing plant and have them work day and night to produce it. Luca then realized that he was indeed not rich enough. With a hint of disappointment, he looked at the other items again. Piquet ball no, capsule no, white pocket no. Big White catch. He took out another utility knife and casually tossed it to Big White. Seeing it carefully grasp the utility knife and clumsily mimic his movements, Luca's mood immediately improved considerably. However, this good mood did not last long. Backpack no. After opening dozens of packages and inspecting all the junk that Luca thought might be related to spatial items, not a single one was the winner. As expected, anything involving blind boxes only ends up being disappointing. Your emotions seem to be fluctuating. Please provide me with relevant psychological counseling materials as soon as possible. Black circle, black circle. Seeing Luca helplessly throw the utility knife on the ground, Baymax, whose movements were becoming increasingly skilled, immediately stopped and looked over. It's okay, let's get to work. Just as Luca, who was suffering a series of setbacks, lost all hope and was preparing to transform into a ruthless delivery robot. Suddenly, I noticed that in Big White's chubby hands, he was carefully holding a long, rectangular box that had just been opened. Wait, what is this? This is a delivery. Black circle, black circle. Ignoring Big White's nonsense, Luca, who had been somewhat numb, immediately and swiftly retrieved the box. Damn it, it's finally shipped. Well done, Baymax, Luca said, giving Baymax a thumbs up. Big White looked at his empty, chubby hands, then at Luca, who was suddenly excited for some reason and blinked his round eyes inexplicably. Unaware of Luca's glare, Luca's attention was now entirely focused on the box in his hand. Well, it wasn't a box, but rather a pair of black half-rimmed glasses sitting quietly inside a long, rectangular glasses case. Reaching out, he took out the black-rimmed glasses that emitted a faint glow, and a pale blue panel quickly popped out. Criminal tracking glasses. Detective Conan World 2.5. Manufacturer, Professor Agasa. Core component, black half-rim glasses. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. 1 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 1 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Item description. These amazing tracking glasses can locate and eavesdrop on enemies within a 20-kilometer radius. Beyond tracking and eavesdropping, these incredible glasses also boast bulletproof protection, telescopic vision, night vision, thermal imaging, and internet connectivity. Truly a cool accessory for when you're out fighting crime. Friendly reminder. In fact, the most amazing ability of these glasses is that even in the dark, simply looking down will allow the entire mirror to reflect light and conceal your gaze, and they are also incredibly durable and will not fall off accidentally unless manually removed. End of this chapter. Chapter 30, The Amazing Tracking Glasses. Chapter 30, The Amazing Tracking Glasses. Hiss. After carefully reading the item descriptions on the panel, Luca immediately gasped, realizing he was making his own small contribution to global warming. It wasn't that he didn't recognize Conan's tracking glasses, but this was the first time Luca had ever heard of such a multifunctional gadget. Logically speaking, eavesdropping, tracking, telescopes, thermal imaging, and all these other functions, taken individually, are not actually considered particularly magical or cutting-edge technologies. However, how can a tracking and eavesdropping range of 20 kilometers, along with other miscellaneous functions, all be condensed into a pair of ordinary-looking glasses? It's even a pair of thin, half-rimmed glasses. The only thing Luca could think of that was slightly better was the Edith that Tony Stark would make for Spider-Man in the future. However, it seems that I happen to have similar components for these synthesis consumables on hand right now. He then proceeded to rummage through the living room again. Big White just stared blankly at Luca's actions, unsure whether he should step in to help. Fortunately, it didn't take long for Luca to gather all the necessary materials for the criminal tracking glasses. Only, are bone conduction Bluetooth headphones considered miniature headphones? Thinking about it was useless, so Luca simply lay down on the ground and redrawn a magic circle. Carefully, the glasses carrier was placed in the center of the magic circle, and the other synthesis materials were also placed in one by one. Yes, the tracking and bugging are fine. They ignored the suitcase-sized tracking device next to them. Miniature batteries are fine too. This completely disregards how much power a button battery can actually provide. As expected, the antenna passed the test even without specifying the size. A satellite dish, the size of a pot lid, was placed at the edge of a compact magic circle. Phew tilde, thank goodness, I was smart after all. Considering that the synthesis required miniature headphones, Luca had a flash of inspiration and disassembled the newly arrived bone conduction headphones into pieces, leaving only a few ribbon cables and the necessary vibration speaker, and even throwing the microphone aside. As expected, the last item also passed the test. However, if this means the synthesized panel needs a large speaker in the future, can I just put the Bluetooth headphones inside an extra-large amplifier and still pass the detection? Let's put this speculation, which cannot be confirmed yet, out of our minds for now. Looking at the magic circle before him, now complete with all the materials, Luca pressed his hands down again. Synthesis. The white light surged and dissipated. Then, a pair of unremarkable black half-rimmed glasses was quietly placed in the center of the magic circle. Without hesitation, Luca stepped forward and picked up the glasses. However, Luca was somewhat taken aback when he saw that the glasses were clean and simple, with only a button on the front of each temple on the left and right sides. What? So many functions, and all we get are these two buttons, and there's not even a manual. It was only then that Luca finally remembered the big white dog that had been standing blankly next to him. Big White, can you scan out how to use this thing? Upon hearing this, Big White's eyes immediately lit up as he quickly scanned the criminal tracking glasses in Luca's hand. However, just as Luca was watching expectantly as Big White finished scanning, the guy blankly spoke up. Its structure is similar to that of Plano glasses, and it is not a medical device. I do not have any instruction manuals for it in my database, but I recommend wearing it. Chinese letter, Luc, who was waiting for Big White's answer, suddenly collapsed to the ground, rolling his eyes in exasperation. Not as enthusiastic as you were when you were scanning. No sooner had Luca uttered those words than the giant white figure in front of him extended a chubby finger and pointed at the tracking glasses in Luca's hand. Immediately afterwards, the projection screen on Big White's belly lit up, and all sorts of random images flashed by quickly. The target electronic product also lacked a user manual or related documentation, and there were no similar products found online. At this point, Luca was completely dumbfounded. He just stood there dumbly, holding up his glasses, watching Baymax do all that. Only after it opened its mouth did it close its own again, asking in utter shock, "Big White, you have this function." At this moment, the screen on Big White's belly had turned off. Hearing this, Big White tilted his head and looked down at Luca, answering quite naturally. "Yes, according to the agreement, I can download any material on the public network using a device with internet access to improve my nursing care capabilities." Luca was taken aback at first, but then he realized that the tracking glasses did indeed have internet connectivity in the previous introduction. However, something like Big White can connect to the internet and even access data simply by clicking, without needing any interface or consent from the other party's equipment. Ultimately, it was still a bit too outrageous. Public network, any data. The agreement only allows me to download medical and nursing-related materials and store them in the relevant partition, which will not affect other modules in my program. Okay. Looks like I underestimated the capabilities of these cutting-edge technologies. Using something like this to learn nursing knowledge? Isn't that a perfect tool for cyber intrusion? Setting aside his exploration of Baymax for the moment, Luca refocused his attention on the tracking glasses in his hand. After thinking it over, he didn't hesitate and took off his gold-rimmed glasses and put on the tracking glasses. Well, it's all right. Although they're non-prescription glasses, the original owner's nearsightedness wasn't severe, so it doesn't affect her vision. But how exactly do you use this thing? And what about the promised accompanying tracking and listening device? As he thought about it, Luca reached out and pressed the button on the left temple of his glasses. The next moment, the lens in front of my left eye flickered and then lit up immediately. At the same time, A very slight clicking sound came from the left temple of the glasses. This is... Luca reached for the small protrusion on the temple of his glasses with his left hand and gently pried it off, removing a button-shaped device about the size of a fingernail. Looking at the button device in his palm, and the semi-transparent radar-like pattern filling his left eyeglass lens, with a red dot flashing continuously in the center of the radar. So this is the tracker. So this is the tracker. The slightly delayed echo reached Luca's ears through the bone conduction headphones inside his glasses. Okay, a tracker with a built-in eavesdropping function. After putting the tracker back in, Luca pressed the button on the right temple of his glasses again to figure out the other functions. This time, although the tracker was not ejected, the screen that used to light up on the left lens of the glasses was moved to the right. What? Wasn't it supposed to have a bunch of features? Where's the zoom? Where's the thermal imaging? Just as Luca was thinking this, the images on the screen of his right eyeglasses kept changing. First, it turned into a square shape, magnifying the image in front of him, and then immediately switched to red and green thermal imaging. And the distribution of heat sources in the body of the giant white thing immediately appeared in Luca's eyes. Voice control? No way, I didn't say anything just now. After several tests, Luca was surprised to find that these so-called criminal tracking glasses could be controlled entirely by thought, as long as he pressed the button on the temple. Whether you want to extend the tracker, switch to tracking mode, zoom in or out to a specific location within your field of vision, lock onto and analyze the target, or even use thermal imaging or connect to the internet, etc. All of this can be accomplished in an instant with just a thought. The speed of identification and the accuracy of judgment are simply incomprehensible. The buttons on the left and right sides are actually only used to switch which screen to turn on. Holy crap, such a tiny pair of glasses actually integrates an EEG sensor. End of this chapter. Chapter 30, A Small Invention. Chapter 30, A Small Invention, third update. Luca had initially thought that his criminal tracking glasses were far inferior to Tony Stark's Edith glasses in terms of functionality, lacking an intelligent voice system and potentially making them more cumbersome to operate. Who knew this thing was actually controlled by brainwaves? It still has to be Professor Agasa who masters the core technologies. That's not right either. It's also possible that the cheat system forcibly added black box abilities in order to restore the original version. Taking off his glasses, Luca rubbed his temples, feeling a bit of a headache. He had originally thought that, apart from its miniaturized integration being far ahead of its time, the technology of these glasses was fairly ordinary, and he might be able to disassemble them and try to replicate them. Now it seems that Luca would never dare to have such thoughts again. After trying running, doing handstands, and shaking his head, but failing to get the glasses off his face, Luca finally decided to lie down. Never mind, as long as it works, that's fine. However, this gave Luca 2 of Professor Agasa's Detective Conan gadgets, and the progress bar was pushed to 2-5. Perhaps we could try consciously collecting the 3 more items from the Conan world. Although he already had the monkey bomb and hex core, which brought Luca's Twin Cities world items to 2-5. However, firstly, there was still no clue about how to synthesize the hex core. And secondly, Luca didn't have much of a clue about what kind of core components were needed for the items in the Battle of Two Cities world, so he had to put this matter aside for the time being. However, the props in the Detective Conan world are different. Whether it's a solar-powered skateboard, a detective badge, a retractable suspender, a soccer belt, or the famous tranquilizer watch, it's pretty clear what these things might be the core components. Even the core components of these things are ordinary daily necessities that are not difficult to obtain. There's no need to talk about having people buy large quantities of stuff. You can just go to a few shopping malls or toy stores, and maybe you can do a large-scale screening and testing yourself. Luca really wanted to see what would happen when he got 5-5. However, this is not something that can be accomplished right now. After briefly testing the various functions of the tracking glasses, Luca didn't take them off again. He continued to work with Baymax to unpack all the remaining packages. Unfortunately, perhaps his good luck for the day had run out, because Luca did not see any more glowing items. Looking at the mess in the living room, Luca hesitated for a moment. Okay, let the cleaning staff clean it up tomorrow. Looking at the time, it was almost 10 o'clock. Luca stretched and stood up, ready to continue with the next task. Before he could even steady himself, Samira's voice came from afar. "Young master, it seems you haven't eaten yet." Samira, who had just entered the living room, had only spoken halfway when she noticed the chubby, white guy standing next to Luca and immediately froze on the spot. Big White, who also noticed Samira's footsteps, turned around, a pale green light shooting from his eyes, and began scanning Samira. "Hello, I'm Baymax. A scan reveals multiple hidden injuries on your body. Recommendation." Looking at the big white dog beside him, who was starting to talk nonstop again, Luca sighed and rubbed his forehead. However, Luca did not choose to interrupt its analysis immediately. He only spoke up briefly to explain during the interval when Big White was describing Samira's physical condition. "This is a medical care robot that I just made. You can listen to Aunt Samira's judgment and advice. It will be good for your health." She was completely stunned, mechanically receiving the information Luca was giving her. Scanning the mess in the living room, Samira couldn't understand how such a chaotic jumble of things could be assembled into such a highly sophisticated, intelligent robot. Even someone like me, who knows absolutely nothing about these technologies, this. Although Luca found it rather amusing to see Samira's dazed expression, he didn't offer any further explanation. He simply pointed at Big White, indicating that she should concentrate on listening to the lecture. He then walked around the messy ground in front of him, went to Samira's side, and took the dinner she had brought him. Luca sat on the carpet, eating dinner while watching Big White analyze how to improve Samira's health, who had already regained her senses. A faint smile appeared on his face. Luca only spoke up after Big White had finished his long explanation. "Big White, do not scan other people's physical conditions without my permission. Yes, and also, making network connections and hacking into other electronic devices also requires my consent. Okay, this instruction has been incorporated into the data protocol. Black circle, black circle." Looking at the chubby white man in front of her who could respond to Luca so freely and even move so naturally, Samira, who finally had a chance to speak, asked in amazement. "Young master, this really was just made by you." A small invention." Luca, who had already finished eating the food on his plate, gently placed his cutlery aside and gave this answer without batting an eye. It's not that Luca has to show off in front of people he's close to. However, explaining such things was too complicated, so he had no choice but to leave it vague. Samira first cautiously poked the Big White, round belly with some curiosity, but then her eyes darkened. I suppose this robot was painstakingly created because young Master Luca wanted to treat Lady Gina. Having considered this, Samira did not ask directly. She was present when the doctor described Gina's condition, so she had a general understanding of the situation. Samira also didn't believe that the robot could help Gina recover. Young Master is indeed a genius, but electrical engineering and medicine are clearly different fields. As long as young Master is happy. However, just as Samira was thinking this, Luca spoke up again. "Aunt Samira, come with me to the hospital tomorrow. I need Big White to scan my mother's symptoms." Upon hearing this, Samira looked at Luca with some surprise, a hint of anticipation in her eyes. "Young Master, what do you mean?" "Yes, mother's condition may be treatable, but we need to confirm the symptoms first. These chapters are transitional, gradually leading into the later plot. After some hesitation, I've decided to post one more chapter to speed up the transition. However, it's true that it's not good to update too much during the initial release period, as it can affect recommendations. So I'll try to control the pace and release more updates after the book is officially launched. TT my poor drafts. End of this chapter, Chapter 32 Upgrade. Chapter 32 Upgrade. Although, according to what Dubai said before, once the medicine is made, It should be able to cure Gina's illness 100%. However, considering the time and complicated steps involved, Luca decided not to explain it to Samira in detail again, as long as she understood that her mother Gina's illness was not hopeless. Anyway, after Bai's test, I can slowly explain to her the preparations needed for the treatment. Only after seeing that Samira, who was somewhat agitated, had calmed down a little, did Luca speak again and ask the question. Aunt Samira, you didn't come here just to bring me food, did you? How long will it take for the materials I mentioned to arrive? Oh, and how's the contact with that tactical squad going? Actually, the former is what Luca truly cares about. Although bodyguards are important, Luca's excitement for the new items is unprecedented, having just synthesized the powerful Big White and tracking glasses. Moreover, although the name Sweet Captive is somewhat nonsensical, it is indeed a mechanical arm with healing effects. Adding to the problem of its constant, glowing, Luca still wanted to synthesize it as soon as possible. However, when he heard Luca's question, Samira's answer slightly disappointed him. The grappling hook and transmission rod that you requested, young master, are already in stock at the company and should be delivered to your home tomorrow. And, well, the different models of vibrators are also relatively easy to obtain. The only trouble is with those treatment devices you mentioned earlier, young master. Since some of them are relatively rare on the market, their delivery time may be a bit slow. Actually, what Samira didn't mention was that the company's weapons department also reluctantly mentioned the grappling hook gun and transmission rod that Luca wanted. To be frank, Luca has no real power within Orange Industries. At most, he's just a 14-year-old boy with the status of the company's heir. It's one thing for these people to ask the weapons department for materials once or twice. They can just treat it as trying to please their future boss, like playing house with children. However, if this continues, these people will inevitably start to complain. Given that Samira is the boss's confidant driver, to be honest, she's not very good at keeping those somewhat arrogant scientific research talents in the weapons department in check. However, these people only dared to complain a little and express their dissatisfaction in a veiled way. Ultimately, it's all for work. Even graduate students have to take care of their advisor's kids. They don't want to cause trouble by ignoring Luca's small request. So Samira didn't choose to say anything and cause Luca unnecessary trouble. The topic returns to the present. After hearing what Samira said, Luca thought about it and decided not to urge her any further, but simply said, "Let's leave it at that for now. Let me know as soon as the treatment device arrives." Okay. Seeing that Luca accepted the topic rather casually, Samira secretly breathed a sigh of relief and then continued to answer the next question. Regarding the tactical squad I mentioned before, I've already contacted Duncan, the squad leader. They've been on standby for the past few days, and they've already set off back after the communication ended. As for the time, we should arrive by the day after tomorrow at the latest. If it's earlier, we should be able to arrive by tomorrow night. As you know, young master, the area around Manhattan has been quite chaotic lately, and things are even more complicated here in Connecticut. Luca casually shook his head upon hearing this. I understand, Aunt Samira doesn't need to explain. But young master, you said you were going to check on Madam's condition tomorrow. Samira hesitated slightly as she said this. It's all right, I still have you, Aunt Samira. Then you should get some rest, young master. I won't disturb you any longer. I'll have the cleaning staff come and clean up the things here tomorrow. As she spoke, Samira prepared to walk towards her room, but she paused slightly, thought for a moment, and added a sentence. Young master, you've just finished eating. You can do some light exercise before going to sleep. Watching Samira's departing figure, Luca couldn't help but smile. Samira, who used to be a bit careless, is now starting to care about my health. However, Luca wasn't actually planning to go to sleep right away. At least, he had other things to do before going to bed. Big White, bring your suitcase and come with me. With that, Luca strode towards the basement stairs of the villa. The big white thing behind him first looked around at the messy ground, then took small steps and quickly walked to the red box that was used to store itself, picked it up, and immediately followed Luca's footsteps. Inside the second basement level. This basement occupies a very large area. There is only one room on the entire second basement level. However, the four corners of this basement room, 3D printers, laser cutting machines, small CNC machine tools, spectrum analyzers, and Fourier transform infrared spectrometers. Linlin's various experimental equipment made the already spacious room seem less empty. In fact, this basement was a private family laboratory, specially commissioned by the original owner's father, Herman. Initially, it was just to occasionally teach Luca some basic theoretical knowledge, cultivate his interest in electronic engineering, and at most, accompany him to make some small robot toys. However, as the variety of equipment increased and was constantly upgraded, it was replaced by items sourced from the company. Later, Herman himself would often use this place as another small laboratory outside the company, doing research and testing in his spare time. However, now, Luca is the only user of this laboratory. Looking at the various scenes in the laboratory, Luca couldn't help but recall bits and pieces of the original owner's memories, those pleasant experiences with his father, Herman. In fact, these memories of the original owner felt more like watching a movie from an outsider's perspective in Luca's mind. This is why, after he transmigrated, he was able to clearly recognize that he was not the original body, and that his relationship with his original parents was always somewhat strained. However, even in movies, the first-person perspective inevitably creates a sense of immersion. The scene was so vividly remembered, and with his father Herman's funeral just today, Luca couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. Honestly, why think so much? Who knows what kind of abilities they might acquire in the future? Reviving Herman, then, would be a way of repaying the favor of occupying the original owner's body. Quickly shaking off these boring thoughts, Luca strode towards a computer. Big White, come here. I'll give you a level up tilde. End of this chapter, Chapter 33, They Didn't and -039, T treat me like an outsider. Chapter 33, They didn't treat me like an outsider. As mentioned before, Luca is going to examine the program inside Big White and try to add something to it. Of course, it's not as simple as just changing the startup and shutdown voices and adjusting the emotion module. More importantly, Luca plans to add some combat procedures to Baymax, just like Hiroshi Hamada did in the original Big Hero 6 manga. However, all of this is predicated on Luca first confirming whether he actually has the ability. After the computer in front of him turned on, Luca turned to look at Big White beside him, intending to call him over, but as soon as he looked up, everything went black. Why are you still holding that box? Put it down and move it aside. Plug it into charge. The portable storage box for the medical robot currently has sufficient battery power. We do not recommend continuing to charge it. Black circle, black circle. Wow, this box even has a scientific name. Then don't charge it. Put the box down and come over here. Luca, who was too lazy to argue with the silly robot Baymax anymore, sighed helplessly and pointed to the corner of the wall to give the command again. This time, the obedient Big White obediently placed the box in the corner, pulled out the power cord, looked at it, and then placed it next to the box before walking over to Luca. But before Luca could speak, the gentle, even-toned voice of the Great White rang out again. Based on the scan, you should rest and get some sleep as soon as possible. Long-term sleep deprivation can lead to a slowed metabolism, weakened immune system, and other health problems. Huh, didn't I say not to start scanning without my permission? The previous instruction was do not scan anyone's body without my permission. According to the agreement, Luca is not considered someone else. Do you want to add you to this instruction? Black circle, black circle. Thank you so much. You didn't treat me like an outsider. Your thanks have been received. Black circle, black circle. Do you want to add you to this command? Big White persisted and asked the question again. I fing. He almost blurted out a curse, but Luca managed to hold it in. After thinking it over, he decided not to argue with the guy anymore. Considering that scanning at any time would help him understand his physical condition, he simply chose to let it go. No need, scan me anytime. But remember, Don't reveal my health condition when other people are present. Fearing that Big White might misunderstand him again, Luca quickly added another sentence. Well, that is, if I don't need anyone else to rescue me, I should still speak up in case of an emergency. A new agreement has been adopted. Black circle, black circle. Okay, it's a bit silly, but it seems all right. After finally getting rid of the guy's distraction, Luca raised his hand and tapped the chip compartment on Big White's chest, and the cylindrical chip compartment immediately popped out. Luca reached out and took off the emerald green chip that recorded Big White's core data, then twirled it in his hand. Tilda, we should have a spare of this type of chip at home Tilda. The chip is inserted into the computer. Upload the database. Open the operation module. The first thing to do, naturally, is to check the production process recorded in the database that Dubai mentioned earlier. However, unlike what Luca had expected, the database did not contain the complete production process of Baymax. Instead, it contained videos documenting Hamada's entire process from the initial design to the completion of Baymax. While these videos are equally useful, compared to direct blueprints, many of the steps and processes require Luca to research and refine them himself. Furthermore, some things that people in that world might simply order, I would have to develop entirely new, cutting-edge technology from scratch. It seems it will still take quite a while before we can truly replicate Baymax. After temporarily setting aside this time-consuming task, Luca briefly browsed through the other parts of the chip. However, this time he breathed a slight sigh of relief. The situation is much better than Luca had feared. Perhaps because this version of Baymax is still in the development stage. Although Luca can't understand many of the core parts at the moment, Hamada designed the modules very neatly and clearly while creating Baymax, leaving enough room for modification in all directions. Upgrades and modifications can still be made even without adjusting the core code. For example, the combat module that Luca wanted to load was originally programmed with a video motion capture plugin. He only needs to load the actions that he wants Baymax to learn into the designated module, and Baymax can directly master all the actions through motion capture simulation. Furthermore, Luca doesn't need to worry about the core medical procedures causing Baymax to refuse to fight, unlike Hiroshi Hamada in the original storyline. Because of the zeroth law, Baymax will obey and carry out any order given by Luca without hesitation. It's better to make an extra chip separately, so that if the original one has problems, we won't have anyone to blame but ourselves. After a moment's thought, Luca simply retrieved another chip, copied the motion system into it, and then loaded all sorts of common combat techniques, even firearms usage and special forces tactical maneuvers, into this brand new chip. Actually, Luca already felt a bit sleepy after finishing this step. The day was filled with emotional ups and downs, and the constant focus on work inevitably led to mental fatigue. However, considering the current situation, Luca still intends to finish all the remaining work in one go. The next step is to scan Baymax's body shape and design external armor based on the data. The tricky part is that Luca needs to design and model it himself. Even with the help of algorithms written by her father, Herman, inside the computer, this was still no small project. Yes, the gloves need some added edges and extra weight. The carbon fiber bulletproof armor printed at home is still not up to par, so the armor I wear needs to be made smoother. As for the stomach area, never mind, let's keep the inflatable interior. At least it can still provide cushioning. If necessary, we can deflate it first and then put on and take off the armor. It doesn't look very neat. Is it a bit ugly? It's okay, it's just a shell. Baymax doesn't have any aesthetic sense anyway. He kept muttering to himself to stay alert while focusing on his work. After working through the night, until all the modeling data was imported into the 3D printer, Luca finally relaxed a little. The 3D printer at home is far inferior to the large machines at the company. It's not good enough in terms of printing speed or the strength of the finished product. Let's make do with it for now, and we'll upgrade debay again at the company when we have the chance. After all of this was done, I watched the battle video slowly uploading and the 3D printer churning out prints. Luca estimated that it would take at least until tomorrow, or rather, this afternoon, to get both of these things done. After yawning widely, Luca reinstalled the green chip that Big White had originally had, and then greeted him sleepily. Now that Big White's gone, let's go upstairs to sleep, Tilda. End of this chapter, Chapter 34, Agent White. Chapter 34, Agent White, third update. Early in the morning, soft sunlight streamed into the bedroom through the huge floor-to-ceiling windows. Luca, who was fast asleep, hummed softly twice, turned over, and wanted to feel more of the morning sunlight. However, the sunlight that had previously shone with warmth on her face seemed to have weakened slightly. Luca, still somewhat dazed, seemed to sense something and subconsciously opened his eyes. Then, in his previously blurry vision, a white steamed bun that almost filled his field of vision squatted motionless by the bed, staring at him. Oh my God! A chilling sensation instantly shot from my toes to my forehead. Luca felt that he had to rely on immense willpower to keep from exclaiming in surprise. Even though he didn't shout out, he was far from sleepy. His eyes were wide open, like copper bells, staring intently at the big white thing in front of him. What are you trying to do now? Detected, you screamed in pain during your sleep. We are waiting for you to wake up so we can provide you with effective treatment and care. Black circle, black circle. A scream? Did I have another nightmare? I don't remember it at all. Now fully awake, Luca propped himself up against the headboard with his left hand and sat up. He then reached out to his side for the prosthetic leg that he had taken off and was charging before going to bed the night before. Wait, didn't I change your startup voice? Oh no, that modified chip is still uploading data downstairs. Having figured out what had happened, Luca wiped his face haphazardly, fastening the prosthetic limb Stark had made, and casually asked a question. So, how do you plan to treat this nightmare situation? The test results show that your hormone fluctuations have returned to normal. Okay, remember next time, don't squat next to me while I'm sleeping. I was almost scared to death just now. Although, Baymax, you're still pretty cute. Received, record new instructions. Seeing Big White like this, Luca retaliated by rubbing Big White's marshmallow-like belly before getting out of bed. I put on my shoes, washed up, and leisurely went downstairs. Shamira was having breakfast in the restaurant downstairs. Young master, please get up. Samira, who was about to greet Luca, immediately noticed Big White following closely behind Luca, taking small steps down the stairs. Although they had already met Baymax and knew that the robot might be able to help treat the lady. But getting used to Baymax's presence so quickly is ultimately not that easy. Good morning, Aunt Samira. Luca yawned as he approached the table, grabbed a still-warm sandwich from the plate, and stuffed it into his mouth. Young master, I'll have someone else. It's all right, let's leave it at that. I need to go down to the underground lab first. We'll set off once I've finished here. Yes, young master. The commercial armored vehicle that I had the company send last night should arrive soon. You can go ahead with your work, there's plenty of time. Luca nodded perfunctorily upon hearing this, then gulped down a large mouthful of milk, grabbed another sandwich, and excitedly ran towards the basement. Here, in the corner, the 3D printer is still working diligently. Several parts that had already been printed were ejected from the machine and were haphazardly piled on a soft mat to the side. However, after looking at the brackets and connecting plates that had not yet been removed from the printed armor, Luca did not hesitate for a moment and decided to wait until all the armor components were printed before polishing and adjusting them himself. Turning my attention to the computer, the analysis and uploading of motion data that I started last night has been completed. From today onwards, your Agent Baymax. With a touch of childlike excitement, Luca wrote the word agent on the brand new black chip and then eagerly inserted it into Big White's chip compartment. As the data loading was complete, Baymax, who had been standing there blankly, tilted its head and looked at Luca, its tone full of doubt that was not in a robot's nature. These fighting and tactical movements don't seem to be helping me become a better medical care robot. Hearing Big White's slightly puzzled voice, Luca chuckled and patted its big belly, teasingly saying, "But this allows you to better protect me, you know?" The best medicine is to prevent all possible dangers before the patient is injured. Upon hearing this, Dubai blinked its big, dark eyes a few times before replying thoughtfully. Okay, I'm Agent Baymax. Luca couldn't help but smile upon hearing this. I looked at Baymax, then at myself. Him tilde a fat guy and a little boy. That combination sounds incredibly powerful. Although he really wanted to test the power of the upgraded Big White right now, Luca ultimately decided against it after glancing around at the ridiculously expensive experimental equipment in the lab. Calling to Big White, they dashed up to the courtyard upstairs before preparing to begin the test. Meanwhile, Samira, who had finished cleaning up the dishes, also heard the noise and followed Luca into the yard, wanting to see what new things Luca had come up with after all that work. Big White, it's your turn to perform. Black circle, black circle. Seeing the puzzled look on the white figure, Luca slapped his forehead and explained in detail. Let's try out the newly loaded combat module, starting with a military-style boxing match. Upon receiving the accurate command, Big White immediately clapped his hands at his sides and stood up straight. Immediately following were a lunge punch, a throat-piercing spring kick, and a horse stance horizontal strike. The series of movements were executed with great skill and power in Dubai's hands, completely dispelling any trace of the clumsy robot he had been before. With each whistling punch, grass and soil in the courtyard flew everywhere. Just as Samira was about to speak, Luca gave a new order first. Big White, that tree. Luca pointed casually. Without the slightest hesitation, Big White kicked the ground with both feet, launching himself forward like a round snowball. Next moment, Big White suddenly threw a punch. Boom! There was a loud bang. The huge tree in the yard, which was almost as big as a person could hug, suddenly exploded, its thick wood fibers scattering and crumbling, and the whole tree slowly fell towards the swimming pool behind it. Before the broken upper half of the tree could fall into the water, Big White rushed over and hugged the tree. Then, with its tiny, shuffling steps, it slowly and leisurely placed the crown on the open ground beside it. Upon seeing this, Luca's smile widened, and he generously gave Big White a thumbs up. Great! At this moment, Samira, who had originally wanted to ask Big White to spar with her, was completely stunned. However, after hesitating for a moment, she couldn't help but blurt it out. Young master, that redwood should be worth around $20,000. Today's chapter is still a bit rushed due to the excessive amount of material. Well, luckily it's the Dragon Boat Festival holiday, so I can write a bit more. At least it offset the loss of the existing manuscripts. End of this chapter, Chapter 30, 5 News from the Hospital. Chapter 30, 5 News from the Hospital. 20,000. This isn't much worse than scrapping a piece of equipment in the lab. Luca, who was initially excited about Big White's combat power, twitched at the corner of his mouth upon hearing this. Even if you're rich, you shouldn't spend money like this. However, the experiment has actually reached a sufficient point. Although it hasn't been equipped with carbon fiber armor yet, aside from the fact that its inflatable design slightly alters its movements, it doesn't actually have a significant impact on Baymax's fighting ability. After all, Baymax itself has very strong mechanical power, and its carbon fiber composite frame also has good defensive capabilities. In addition, considering the positions of the hands and feet, and the need to maintain balance and lift heavy objects in caregiving work, the intensity and effort required are far beyond the standard. Baymax is already a very deceptive and excellent combat robot. However, there are still many exposed wires and important equipment on the skeleton, so protection still relies more on external armor. I wonder if all the armor components will be printed by the time I get back tonight. Unfortunately, although the motion module used for firearms was imported, Big White's hands are too big, so a custom-made firearm will still be needed later. In fact, Luca was already considering whether to develop a batch of pure combat bodyguard robots based on Baymax. After all, Big White is certainly more experienced in medical care. However, the field of medical devices is also very complex, and since our company has no prior connections in this area, rashly making contact could very likely backfire. Well, all of that will have to wait until I have complete control of the company. Just as Luca was thinking this, bulletproof vehicles from the company arrived outside the villa. Young master, when would you like to depart? Leave now. New York, Brooklyn, Wellhaven Hospital. Although this hospital is not as old as the Presbyterian Hospital, it excels in all aspects of medical care. However, in the fields of neurology and neurosurgery alone, it is absolutely a leader in the entire United States. Otherwise, Luca wouldn't have specifically transferred his mother to this hospital. In the VIP ward, Samira was talking to Gina's attending physician about her condition over the past 2 days. Luca simply watched his mother quietly from the side. Although Gina is over 40 years old this year, her exquisite appearance makes her look more than 10 years younger than her actual age. Especially now that she is in a coma, she has completely lost the aura of a powerful businesswoman she used to have, and instead appears more serene and gentle. Without knowing her true background, it's hard to imagine that she was once a powerful female warrior who dominated the chaotic battlefields of Sokovia, let alone that she could kill 3 Zeta Swiss soldiers before she was on the verge of losing consciousness. So, having gone to such lengths for someone as insignificant as me, you'll probably regret it if you knew the truth, won't you? As Luca was quietly watching Gina in a daze, Samira's voice suddenly rose, drawing Luca's attention as well. So, Dr. West, you mean that Madam now has a chance of recovery? Samira stared excitedly at the doctor, wanting to grab his arm and press him for answers, but afraid of being too abrupt, she could only clench her fists in the air. The doctor, Gina's attending physician, after seeing Samira's expression, glanced subtly at Luca, who was also looking at him, before somewhat awkwardly offering an explanation. Well, it's just a possibility. Several families with similar severe cases chose to give up treatment. After communication between the hospital and the families, we are now preparing to form an expert team to conduct experimental treatments for these patients. If the treatment is ultimately successful, perhaps Mrs. Orange can also receive effective treatment. Luca's lips twitched upon hearing this. This so-called experimental treatment by an expert group sounds impressive, but the only key word is actually experimental. The process of performing this operation is even more complicated and cumbersome than the process of a patient signing an organ donation agreement. It's basically no different from conducting human trials, and under normal circumstances, no hospital would take such a big risk to do something like that. Does Dr. West know what the success rate of this experimental treatment is? Samira asked this question. Although Luca had said last night that he might be able to cure Gina, the hospital was clearly more authoritative to her. However, Dr. West, who was being questioned, became even more embarrassed when he spoke. Well, we've only just started preparing the expert team, and no one can be sure of the success rate. However, we'll be inviting Dr. Strange and several other leading figures in neurology to join the team, so their capabilities are definitely up to par. Upon hearing this, Luca immediately frowned. When his mother Gina was first diagnosed, he asked someone to invite Stephen Strange, but in the end, he was rejected outright without even meeting him. What is the reason behind their decision to get involved in this mess again? The reason it's described as muddy waters is because, judging from Dr. West's words, this so-called expert group clearly doesn't have any treatment plans, and it hasn't even been formally established yet. In this situation, the probability of finding an effective treatment in a short period of time is extremely low. In addition, given the less-than-ideal label of experimental treatment, who would have the power to persuade that arrogant guy to cooperate? It's important to know that, before becoming Dr. Strange, Stephen Strange was hardly a benevolent person. To ensure his own surgical success rate and reputation in the medical community, he generally avoids surgeries he feels he cannot succeed at. Of course, given Strange's skill level, surgeries he felt had virtually no chance of success could indeed be considered a death sentence. So, may I ask who proposed the formation of this expert group? Luca stared intently at Dr. West, awaiting his answer. Seeing the questioning look in the eyes of the boy in front of him, Dr. West's eyes flickered slightly. but then calmed down a bit. I don't know, but even if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. Luca stared at him for a moment, then simply nodded calmly. Thank you, Dr. West, for bringing us this news. Next, I want to spend some time alone with my mother. With that, Luca gestured for Samira to see the guest out, then turned away and ignored her, taking out the medical kit containing Big White. End of this chapter, Chapter 36, The Mysterious Sponsor. Chapter 36, The Mysterious Sponsor, yeah? I must have been out of my mind last night to think of changing the startup command to this. Lincoln, damn head. As Luca finished speaking, the red storage box in front of them quickly unfolded. The figure of Big White stood upright and inflated, then took small steps to Luca's side. I'm Baymex, your personal healthcare partner. Black circle, black circle. Yes, I know who you are. Scan her body for me. Luca pointed to Gina lying on the hospital bed. The next moment, the green light in Dubai's eyes quickly scanned Gina's entire body, and then gave its judgment. The target's vital signs are stable, but some nerve signal transmission is blocked, and the nerve synapses are covered with cocooning proteins. Recommendation. Big White repeated his assessment from last night, and Luca asked a question as he listened. According to what you said before, can targeted drugs treat this? If the target condition is still in its early stages, and targeted therapy is continued for more than 12 weeks, the success rate of treatment is 87.6%, Dubai replied. Samira's face lit up with joy upon hearing this. The doctor had just brought good news, and now the robot created by the young master had also given a high probability of a cure. It seems that the lady does indeed have a chance to wake up. However, compared to Samira's optimism, Luca frowned slightly. 12 weeks, that's 3 months. And if you factor in the time it takes to develop the drug, it will probably take at least 6 months or even a year for him to wake up. Big White, can this condition worsen during its course? Luca asked again. The database shows that cocooning syndrome causes the cocooning protein to slowly thicken over time. As long as the patient's daily care and muscle and nerve stimulation exercises are maintained, it will not affect vital signs. However, the continuously thickening cocooning protein will make it more difficult for subsequent targeted drugs to break down the cocooning protein, thus slowing down the patient's recovery time. I don't really trust the expert team. It seems we need to find a suitable biopharmaceutical lab to collaborate with as soon as possible. Under Samira's slightly worried gaze, Luca looked up at him again and said with a serious expression, Aunt Samira, please help me contact a lawyer and a family foundation. I need to calculate how much of my assets I can currently access. Yes, although it's all their own money, it's not like Luca can just use it whenever he wants. Even if they have drug formula information, it would probably cost a considerable amount to send a laboratory to help them develop pharmaceuticals. Given Luca's current age, if he wants to access significant assets or sell funds or stocks under his parents' names, he will need to go through certain procedures. Fortunately, the money was used to treat Gina's mother, which made the legal procedures much simpler. After discussing the assets, Luca added more details. Also, I would like to trouble Aunt Samira to ask around and find out who sponsored and proposed the establishment of the expert group at the hospital. From Luca's perspective, none of his family connections had ever convinced Strange to diagnose his mother. It's unclear who it is right now, but not only did they bring in Strange, but they also brought in a team of experts from the hospital and came up with something like experimental treatment, so they must have considerable influence. Perhaps it's someone important whose family members also have similar symptoms. If that's the case, there are other ways to quickly develop the drug formula I have. Samira nodded upon hearing this and wrote down all the tasks to be done. Perhaps, after some time, I can bring my mother home to take care of her, Luca thought. This condition is similar to that of a person in a vegetative state. It neither suddenly worsens, nor can it be cured simply by resting. Previously, the mother, Gina, was kept in the hospital primarily because the medical staff there were more professional, and also because there was a glimmer of hope that treatment might be possible. Now, the treatment direction is clear, and Big White himself is the best professional medical caregiver. bringing Gina home to care for her would also be more convenient. However, all of this will have to wait until Luca has sorted out all the troubles he's currently dealing with. After staying in the ward for more than 2 hours, Luca and Samira got up to leave. According to Samira, the tactical team should arrive around this evening, and Luca naturally doesn't plan to meet them at the hospital. Moreover, the 3D printing project that's still running at home should be nearing completion. Luca had originally planned to take this opportunity to visit a nearby shopping mall and see if there was any possibility of finding the core components. However, after Samira's strong persuasion, he temporarily gave up the idea. After all, I still have a sweet captive that I haven't synthesized yet, so there's no rush to get new components. On the way back, Samira's phone rang while she was driving. After a brief call, she continued to drive steadily ahead, but spoke to Luca in a serious tone. "Young master, the matter of dragon that you asked me to hire has yielded results." Upon hearing this, Luca, who had been resting with his eyes closed, sat up straight and waited quietly for Samira to continue. Although Dragon has not yet been found, there are traces of him over the past 2 years. 2 years ago. Listening to Samira's unhurried narration, Luca got a general understanding of the situation. Since Dragon was ousted from the company by Gina 2 years ago, instead of staying in New York, he took the money and went on a lavish lifestyle, enjoying it with Gina's charity. During this period, he also had the idea of investing in some small companies in hopes of making a comeback and humiliating his sister. But several failed investments made Dragon give up this unrealistic idea. About a year ago, thanks to his previous investment experience and a large amount of remaining cash, Dragon became a well-known high roller in Las Vegas. However, the funds he had were ultimately just a source of water without a source. After a period of hedonistic indulgence, all of Dragon's cash was completely drained by Las Vegas, a bottomless pit of money, leaving him only able to rely on his previous good reputation to continue swindling, cheating, and borrowing. However, not long ago, he was said to have been almost hunted down and buried alive, but he suddenly paid off the debts owed to the most powerful parties and then disappeared from Las Vegas. It seems that the force that arranged for several gunmen to protect Dragon may have paid off the debt for him, or rather, transferred the debt to themselves. The reason why the investigation was able to be so thorough is that there are still quite a few debts owed to him by individuals that have not yet been repaid. Even now, there are still many people in Las Vegas who don't understand the situation, cursing and searching for him. So, it's still impossible to determine who's behind this. Yes, but young master, the private investigator also found something else. Of the 3 vehicles that attacked us that day, 2 of the large trucks came from a shell company called United Construction. End of this chapter, Chapter 37, The Intruders. Chapter 37, The Intruders, 3rd update. United Construction, a shell company. Luca repeated the keywords that Samira had mentioned. Yes, this company called United Construction recently reached a cooperation agreement with the municipal government to be responsible for the post-disaster reconstruction work in the Hell's Kitchen area. However, according to the private investigator's findings, this company has actually only been established for less than a year. It has never even had any real estate business before. So he suspected that someone was just using the name of this shell company to obtain the construction permit by bribing officials. Luca, sitting in the back seat, frowned and remained silent upon hearing this. If the name United Construction only sounded somewhat familiar to him, then adding Hell's Kitchen made it hard not to think of a certain notorious workaholic villain whose body was supposedly 90% muscle. Kingpin, the underground emperor of New York. Well, in fact, Kingpin may not be as famous as he is today. Leaving aside the underground gangs, at least among the publicly known social philanthropists, there hasn't yet been a kind, big guy named Wilson Fisk. According to the timeline in the MCU, Kingpin should not have started to go through the process of going out of jail yet, and his gang's influence has not yet reached its peak. Whether he successfully laundered his money through real estate deals following the Battle of New York remains unknown to Luca. But why did Kingpin suddenly target me? However, as soon as the thought crossed his mind, Luca shook his head helplessly. His current predicament is undoubtedly like a child carrying gold through a bustling market. A common man is innocent, but possessing a treasure is a crime. The company is huge and has various assets, but the father is dead, the mother is in a coma, and he has not yet truly inherited the estate, nor does he have any resources at his disposal. If a stranger has even the slightest evil thought, they might actually act on it, let alone when the other party is a villain like Kingpin who has no bottom line. Luca was even grateful to the other two minority shareholders who died in the Battle of New York for not challenging him yet, as they had slowed down the others' actions. Well, we can't lock onto the target right away. With the limited information we have, it's not necessarily Kingpin who's behind it all. We need to find my cheap uncle first before making a decision. After all, based on the information available at the moment, everything is still just Luca's speculation. If Luca really chooses the wrong target and needlessly provokes a troublesome figure like Kingpin, it would be a loss for him. Even if you use your ultimate move to summon Tony Stark as a divine intervention, without any concrete evidence, it's impossible for Tony Stark to simply drive his Mark armor to kill Kingpin or stay by your side to protect you at all times. In the end, you can only rely on yourself. Aunt Samira, this private investigator, seems quite capable. He's gathered so much information in such a short time. Have him find out Dragon's whereabouts as soon as possible. I'm willing to pay extra. Clear. Speechless all the way. Not long after, Luca and Samira returned home. After a quick dinner, Luca rushed into the underground laboratory. The 3D printed armor of the giant white creature was now complete. Luca carefully inspected it, then smoothed out the rougher parts before finally calling over the giant white creature to install and test each piece of armor on it. Looks pretty good. I can spray it with gold and red later, so you can pretend to be Iron Man Tilda. Wearing a full suit of armor, Big White stood there blankly, his eyes blinking rapidly, looking anything but imposing. This doesn't seem to help with healthcare work. Black circle, black circle. Do you remember what I said? The best medical care is to prevent all possible dangers before the patient is injured. Black circle, black circle. That's right, you're much better at stopping danger now. As he spoke, Luca patted Baymax's new armor, which had become noticeably stronger. It's a pity the materials for the arm haven't arrived yet, otherwise we could synthesize it together. Once the tactical squad that Samira mentioned arrives tomorrow, we can go find the new core components. Now, whether it's finding the mastermind or searching for Dragon's whereabouts, Luca himself has no say and can only leave it to his subordinates. It seems that all we can do is passively wait while expanding our own resources. If I had tracking goggles when I saw Dragon at the funeral, I wouldn't be worrying so much now. Just as Luca was thinking this, there was a sudden, urgent knocking at the entrance to the underground staircase. Young Master Luca, are you inside? Hearing Samira's slightly anxious call, Luca was a little puzzled, but he still pressed the button next to the computer desk and opened the laboratory door. Come in. Upon hearing this, Samira immediately pushed open the door and entered. Luca then noticed that she had a pistol ready in her hand. Young Master, there seemed to be intruders outside the villa. Just now, Samira was on the 3rd floor of the villa talking to the Orange family's foundation, preparing to schedule a time to discuss Luca allocating some funds to hire people to develop targeted drugs. However, she noticed from the open window on the 3rd floor that 2 suspicious vans were speeding toward the villa in the distance. It's worth noting that the Orange family's seaside villa in Connecticut is located in a relatively remote area, originally intended for vacation use. Most of the time, the villas are left vacant and are cleaned regularly by a professional villa management company. Most of the villas in the area are in a similar situation. As far as Samira knew, none of the neighboring houses that were relatively close to Orange's house had been occupied recently. The moment those 2 vans with their clearly defined purpose appeared, they immediately caught her attention. when Samira saw the van stop far away in an open space, and a dozen or so people suddenly poured out. Even though it was already night, and she was too far away to see clearly whether those people were carrying weapons, Samira still made her judgment in an instant. The other party was coming for young Master Luca. The reason they didn't stop close was simply to avoid the sound of the car being too close and attracting the attention of the people inside the house. Faced with this situation, Samira immediately grabbed her gun and rushed downstairs to find Luca. However, after hearing Samira mention an intruder, Luca himself became less nervous, simply reaching out and quickly clicking a few times on the desktop. The previously empty wall next to it immediately shifted horizontally and unfolded, revealing a weapon rack full of various types of guns. Luca shrugged slightly and gestured with his hand. Try not to use these on the right, as those don't have a permit to carry them. On the last day of the holiday, there are still 3 chapters. I feel like I'm really asking for trouble by updating 3 times a day during the new book period. After starting work, I'll try my best to write 3 chapters a day, but how many I publish depends on the situation. I might save some for a big release. End of this chapter. Chapter 38 Destruction Mode, activated. Chapter 38 Destruction Mode, activated. This entire wall of weapons was obviously not prepared by Luca. In fact, all of these were from the collection of Luca's father, Herman, before his death. However, due to the large number of wealthy people in Connecticut, the control and use of firearms are relatively strict. Therefore, these guns are really just collectibles. Apart from occasionally taking them out for maintenance and playing with, Herman has basically never actually used them. Young master, you'd better stay here and not go out. I'll go deal with them. Samira walked directly to the weapon rack beside her, picked up a weapon, and immediately prepared to go out and fight the enemy. However, before she could take a step, Luca reached out and stopped her. Wait a moment. While stopping Samira, Luca quickly typed a few keystrokes on the keyboard with his left hand, soon bringing up the surveillance footage of the entire villa, which he then dragged onto the other monitors. As Samira had predicted, the surveillance footage showed that the cameras at various angles outside the villa had captured masked men in black, armed with weapons, sneaking into the villa. He glanced at the screen in front of him, then at the white giant beside him who had just finished donning his armor. Without any hesitation, Luca pressed the temple of the tracking glasses to pop out the tracker. He got up and placed it into the interface that had been pre-reserved during the manufacture of the great white head armor. At the same time, he took out a Bluetooth earphone and handed it to Samira. Under Samira's somewhat puzzled gaze, Luca gently patted the white-armored arm and smiled. Let Big White lead the charge this time. Although she had witnessed Baymax using boxing before, Samira still didn't think that this robot had much actual combat power. However, this was not the right time to continue arguing. Seeing Luca's confident eyes, she decisively shut her mouth and chose to obey her young master's orders. Big White, connect the tracking glasses. Tracking glasses connected. Black circle, there were also some dazed, oblivious to what was happening, who were simply faithfully carrying out Luca's orders. As he commanded Big White to connect to the glasses, Luca himself pressed the button on the left side of the glasses again. At the same time, with a thought, a thermal imaging image with a red-green gradient immediately appeared on the left lens. Luca quickly looked up and scanned the area above, where all the enemies who had entered the area were clearly visible in the thermal imaging. Tisk, just the penetrating power of thermal imaging alone is enough to keep those weapons companies researching for a lifetime. Clearing his mind of distractions, Luca immediately gave the order to Big White beside him. Big White, activate destruction mode. Upon hearing this, the previously somewhat naive Big White instantly changed its demeanor. Its previously dark eye camera emitted a chilling red light, and the voice it uttered became extremely cold. Receive. Even Samira, standing beside him, paused slightly upon seeing the large white building radiating a chilling killing intent. Luca continued to give instructions. Big White, go up and take care of all the enemies. Yes, the best medicine is to eliminate all enemies. As Big White walked up the stairs step by step, Luca spoke to Samira beside him. Aunt Samira, follow Big White carefully and do as I say. After speaking, Luca sat back down in front of the monitor screen. Samira was relieved to see that Luca had no intention of taking any risks. She weighed the submachine gun in her hand, released the safety, and followed Big White without saying a word. Watching Samira's retreating figure as she went upstairs, Luca adjusted the microphone in front of him, grinned, and then spoke slowly and deliberately. There are 16 enemies around the villa. They have no heavy weapons and are in groups of 4. They are infiltrating the villa from the 4 directions of east, west, south, and north. Aunt Samira, don't show yourself yet. Let Baymax give them a little surprise. At this moment, the intruders surrounding the villa upstairs were unaware of what was about to happen. A dozen or so people were cautiously making their way towards the villa in the dark. However, just as the 4 intruders from the due west direction stepped into the courtyard, the villa, which had been brightly lit with lights on in most of the rooms, suddenly went completely dark. Only a few streetlights from the street outside the villa could barely illuminate the courtyard. Before they could react, a huge black shadow suddenly darted out of the house. Subsequently, boom! There was an explosion. The armed intruder at the front was struck dumb and was sent flying backward with a bang. What the hell is that? Fire, fire. Da-da-da-da. The muzzles of the 2 carbines rapidly emitted continuous flames, which flickered and illuminated the surroundings. Yes, only 2 people fired the shots. Just as the first person was sent flying, Big White, who had already reached him, raised his foot and kicked the second intruder away as well. The remaining 2 men, upon seeing Bai's figure clearly, were terrified and quickly turned their guns away. A hail of bullets rained down on Big White. In fact, these bullets were still able to cause some damage to Big White's makeshift armor. However, the 2 men's shots, fired in a panic, were not very accurate. Moreover, Baymax in destruction mode won't just stand there and let the enemy attack. Command, eliminate the enemy. The voice coming from his mouth was an icy, mechanical one. Big White reached out with his 2 large hands and instantly grabbed the 2 submachine guns that were firing at him. A piercing scream came from both of the intruders at the same time. Both men's weapons, along with their forearms, were firmly gripped by Big White's fan-like hands. Catcha tilde. A crisp sound of bone cracking rang out. The intense pain had already stopped the 2 men from firing. They ignored the 2 people who were in so much pain that they were almost unconscious. Big White raised his arms and casually tossed it aside. The 2 intruders, like their companions, lay unconscious in a corner of the courtyard. It's too late, but it's soon. In fact, only 2 or 3 seconds passed from the time the villa lights went out to the time the enemy opened fire, and then to when Big White took out the last person. Even so, the gunfire and screams here clearly alerted the enemies who were invading from the other 3 directions. Knowing that their whereabouts had been exposed, these people simply stopped hiding. Shouting, they began firing their guns into the villa. Meanwhile, the 4 people at the main gate, while firing, also rushed towards the location of Bai. And this time, down in the basement, Luca gritted his teeth and cursed under his breath. Damn it, my house. End of this chapter, Chapter 39, Dealing with the Intruders. Chapter 39, Dealing with the Intruders. Damn it, my house. Luca had anticipated that since someone had come to his door, his house would inevitably suffer some damage. He never expected that these bastards would start firing wildly at the entire villa without even seeing his face. Fortunately, Samira listened to his advice and did not show herself immediately. Otherwise, she would probably have been suppressed by this hail of bullets. Of course, even if there is no immediate danger, Luca is not prepared to let things go unchecked. These bastards made me lose money, so may they lose their lives. Big White, throw the tree, that intruders from the south. At Luca's command, the red light in the white eyes flashed again. Roger that, throw the tree. The upper half of the redwood tree that was smashed by Big White's punch is still left in the yard and hasn't been cleared away yet. Big White quickly bent down, wrapped his arms around the tree, and squeezed hard with his fingers. All 8 fingers of the gauntlet disappeared into the tree trunk with a thud. Immediately afterwards, the large white camera scanned the south side of the villa's main entrance, where 4 people were firing and approaching. The alarm sounded in the system, and in an instant, all 4 members of the team were accurately locked onto. The next moment, Big White, with its feet buried in the ground, suddenly exerted its strength. The enormous redwood tree was thrown high into the air by Big White. Boom! A deafening crash of a heavy object slamming into the ground. The ground surrounding the villa seemed to tremble with the loud noise. Even Luca in the basement seemed to vaguely sense that dust had been shaken off the ceiling. The tremendous tremor silenced the battlefield for a moment. However, Luca, who was constantly observing the battle outside through the monitoring equipment, noticed that the tree trunk that Da threw had just missed hitting the 4 intruders on the south side by a hair's breadth. Was the force calculation wrong? Luca wondered slightly. However, in reality, this did not have a significant impact. Because the tree trunk fell so close, all 4 intruders were knocked to the ground by the heavy impact, and the guns in the hands of 3 of them even slipped from their grasp. Big White, those 4 guys aren't out of fighting yet. Go and take care of them. Receive. Upon receiving the order, Big White leaped over the large tree in front of him and landed in front of the 4 people. Then came bang, 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 4 punches in quick succession. The 4 intruders, who hadn't even settled down yet, immediately fell asleep. The battle has continued until now, and half of the enemy has been wiped out. As Luca watched the intruders on the north side of the monitor begin to change their magazines in unison, he couldn't help but shake his head in disgust. They don't even have the awareness of alternating firing. These people are so unprofessional. At first, they managed to divide their forces and infiltrate in a somewhat organized manner. But as soon as Dabai's side made their move, these people started firing indiscriminately. Not to mention those unlucky guys on the west side, who screamed in agony and were instantly dealt with. We haven't even seen a single person from the north, yet they've already emptied a whole magazine of ammunition. If these are indeed Kingpin's men, as I suspected, then it just goes to show how utterly hopeless these gangs are. The internal monologue didn't affect Luca. The moment he noticed that these idiots were all reloading at the same time, Luca immediately gave the order to Samira, who had been waiting impatiently. At the north back door, 4 idiots are reloading. 2 are behind the Pixiu statue, and the other 2 are approaching the villa. In fact, as soon as Luca finished speaking the first few words, the impatient Samira had already rushed out of the stairwell on the first basement floor like a cheetah. Without even leaving the room, he had already quickly aimed his submachine gun, separated by the floor-to-ceiling windows that were long since shattered. Da-da-da-da-tilde. With a burst of gunfire, the 2 intruders at the front were instantly shot and fell to the ground. The 2 guys behind, who were loading their guns, were thinking of retreating behind the stone statue to take cover. To everyone's surprise, Samira took only a few steps, and her figure had already rushed several meters away. Immediately afterwards, he leaned back, pushed his legs forward, and slid to the ground, speeding to the middle of the 2 stone statues at the back door. A pistol in his left hand, and a submachine gun in his right. Da-da-da-tilde. Several gunshots rang out in succession. The last 2 men on the north side were both shot multiple times in the forehead and chest, and fell to the ground dead. After dealing with the 2 enemies, Samira rolled over and quickly got up. Sometime later, the lights in the villa had been turned back on. Samira casually shoved the pistol into her pocket, pressed her earpiece with one hand, and asked in rapid succession, "Where are the 4 people on the east side?" "Big White is already taking care of it," Luca said through the headset. Upon hearing this, Samira immediately set off and arrived at the East Garden in no time. And indeed, this place was just as Luca had described. As soon as she arrived, she saw Big White casually wave his hand, sending an intruder flying high into the air. And by sheer coincidence, this unfortunate fellow ended up hanging on a large tree on the left side of the garden, where he could only wail and struggle. Then Big White raised his hand and gently pushed, and the last enemy flew out of the villa fence with a terrified scream. It's unclear whether the push was too light or the person was just lucky. After crashing into several fences and landing on its feet, it struggled and staggered to its feet again, then ran desperately into the distance without looking back. Seeing this, Samira quickly raised her submachine gun, ready to finish off this escaped fish. But before she could aim and fire, an arm reached out and gently pressed the muzzle of her gun down again. "Aunt Samira, I let this person go on purpose. I had Big White put a tracking device on him." Yes, just now, with that gentle push from Big White, the tracker that Luca had placed inside Big White's helmet before the battle began had been silently placed on that person. Luca took the submachine gun from Samira, casually fired a few shots at the open space, scaring the man into running even faster before returning the gun to Samira. "Young master, what do we do next?" Samira then asked softly. Perhaps it was because Luca had been in command the whole time, or perhaps it was because they were able to deal with more than 10 invaders so easily this time. Unbeknownst to her, Samira had begun to rely on Luca to take the lead in matters related to combat, waiting for his instructions. As Luca watched the survivor disappear into the night, he first raised his hand and shot the intruder still hanging in the tree, then spoke softly. "Go get the car first, we'll follow. May everyone never run out of books to read again." End of this chapter. Chapter 40, I am a robot. Chapter 40, I am a robot. Young master, are you going to personally track that person down? What if? At this point, Samira really didn't want Luca to take any more risks. Don't be fooled by how easily these intruders were dealt with today. The enemy has already dared to so openly send gunmen to attack the villa. If they were to actually track them all the way to the enemy's lair? What if something happens to the young master? How can I explain it to the madam? Given the current situation, Samira believes the best solution is to call the police and seek their protection. As for the revenge after the mastermind is found, she and the assassination squad can carry it out together. However, Luca shook his head again upon hearing this. He raised his hand and gently tapped the tracking glasses. Noticing that the tracker was moving away from him faster, he guessed that the surviving intruder had already escaped to the parking spot, gotten into the car, and driven away. He then spoke again. "Aunt Samira, we're just following from a distance, and it's hard to say whether we'll end up taking action. Time is of the essence, let's go get the car first." Seeing this, Samira, though still looking somewhat troubled, eventually obeyed and turned to walk towards the underground parking garage. However, she also made a decision in secret. Once the location of that person is traced, I must ensure that young Master Luca will not take any risks. Just as Samira went to the garage to get her car, Luca was preparing to finish off the remaining intruders one by one. After some consideration, although Luca could kill all of them without any problem because of the castle law, he decided to leave 2 of the guys he liked alive. One reason was that if he didn't get any information from tracking down the escaped guy, he could come back and interrogate him again. Another reason was that if the police got involved later, it would be easier to get strong testimony. Given the effect of the Dominator non-lethal electromagnetic tranquilizer dart, the last 2 lucky ones won't be able to wake up tonight at least. There's plenty of time to wait for Luca and the others to return before interrogating them. Of course, it would be even better if we could seize the time to catch up with our target and find the real mastermind behind tonight's events. However, at the very moment of delivering the final blow, Luca made a surprising discovery. Tonight, all the intruders, except for the one I deliberately let escape and the 4 who were killed by Samira, were simply unconscious. Even more surprisingly, most of these people only suffered minor abrasions, aside from being knocked unconscious by the impact. The most unfortunate one only suffered a minor fracture in his lower leg. What these people have in common is that they were all dealt with by Big White. Turning to look at the large white figure beside him, whose eyes were still glowing red, Luca sighed inwardly and gave the order. Big White, deactivate destruction mode. Right arrow, black circle, black circle. Received, hello Luca. Whether it was due to his posture, or simply because the red light in his eyes had disappeared, Dabai's demeanor suddenly changed. Even the eyes, which should have been just 2 completely black cameras, seemed to have become much clearer. I violated healthcare procedures. I harmed human beings. The voice that Dabai sent was still flat. But for a fleeting moment, Luca inexplicably detected a hint of grievance in his voice. Big White, you're doing this to protect me. Luca was slightly stunned after speaking, not expecting to say such a thing. Even the person being spoken to is a robot. A moment of silence fell over the room, until finally Big White, the robot whose emotions were unreadable, spoke first. The best medical care is to prevent all possible dangers before the patient is injured. As he spoke, Big White extended his large hand and gave Luca a thumbs up. However, this gesture only made Luca more silent. In fact, Luca had already realized this when he discovered that all the enemies dealt with by Big White were only unconscious. Even in destruction mode, Baymax always tries its best to hold back and not harm humans. Of course, this is also related to the fact that Luca's previous orders were all vague instructions, such as deal with the enemy, attack, and throw trees, and Big White himself did not disobey his orders. Luca knew very well that even if he gave the order to kill the enemy, because of the zeroth law, Baymax would definitely choose to carry it out without reservation. But is this really necessary? Would you really let this silly marshmallow with an emotional module personally take someone's life? Fine, this is good enough. Just take good care of my life and health from now on, Dabai. Let others handle the assassin's job. Luca himself never expected that he, a bastard who wouldn't hesitate to take a life at a crucial moment, would actually want to protect a robot's innocence. With a self-deprecating shake of his head and a laugh, Luca reached out and gently patted the slightly scratched armor on Big White's body. Still puzzled, Big White tilted his head slightly upon hearing this, blinking as he watched Luca pat his hand lightly. Is Luca concerned about me? I'm a robot, I don't need psychological counseling. Black circle, black circle. Hearing Big White's words, Luca smiled again. However, compared to his self-deprecating smile earlier, this one was much more natural. Tisk tilde this guy, he claims to be a robot, but his emotions are far richer than many humans tilde. Just as Luca was internally complaining about Baymax, Samira had already driven her car out of the underground parking garage. Considering the potential dangers of this trip, she still chose the bulletproof Cadillac that the company had previously arranged for her to drive. However, while this ensures safety inside the vehicle, it makes it a bit troublesome for a big guy like Baymax to squeeze onto the bus. There shouldn't be any problem removing the armor and returning to the suitcase. But if a battle breaks out later and the unarmored White gets damaged, Luca will have nowhere to turn for help. However, considering the ongoing tracking and the unknown number of bustling areas they would pass through, it was clear that they would be following along. After a moment's hesitation, Luca took out several of the larger pieces of armor from Big White and stuffed them all into the trunk. Big White, give it a push. Let out a little air, it's almost in. Okay, tilde. Samira, sitting in the driver's seat, looked at the big, white, chubby man who had filled the entire back seat, and her lips twitched almost imperceptibly, but she ultimately didn't say anything. Hopefully, no one will check along the way. After getting back on the bus, Luca reached out and patted the big white car behind him. Samira then stepped on the gas and drove off in the direction of Manhattan. Let me explain why yesterday's events were arranged. Those who have read this far should be able to see that Luca has the kind of personality that doesn't mind killing enemies at all. So, given that he has a robot like Baymax with decent combat power, Luca certainly wouldn't let it go to waste when his own strength is still weak. However, this actually goes against Baymax's kind nature. So, to ensure Baymax doesn't go around killing people, Luca can't just jump in and say, Baymax is so cute, I'll make him a good medical robot. It definitely takes time. Then, although Luca doesn't mind killing enemies, he's not a heartless, cold-blooded monster. All of Baymax's naive but fundamentally good qualities as a robot also influence Luca to some extent. His appearance is most appropriate when Luca is currently lacking in support. He is an important pillar, has a certain degree of recognition, and can also serve as a buffer in difficult circumstances, preventing Luca from going astray due to constant tension. That's about it. End of this chapter. All right, legends, that's it for today. If you're ready for the next chapter, smash that like button and flood the comments right now. Remember, we've got 3 days to prove this story needs to continue. Subscribe so you don't miss the drop, and I'll meet you in the next audiobook.